Hey guys. This is what if Naruto was in Lord of the Rings. He had been wandering these lands for the longest time, having left his world behind when given the chance to do so. To most, he is simply a stranger who goes from one place to another. But when he inadvertently gets himself involved with a quest that could mean the life or death of the world, he decides that it's time to stop being a stranger and be a part of something once more. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 1. A Stranger in the Lands. Location: Rivendell. Lord Elrond Half-Elven sat at his desk in Rivendell. He was waiting for Gandalf to arrive so that they speak with one another. It had been some years since they had talked with one another, but with rumors of dark things raising they were much too busy. But now they must talk, for he had received strange news once too often. "Father," Elrond said as he stepped through the door. "Mithrandir is here." "Send him in," he told his son. He stood aside and Gandalf the Grey came in. "Lord Elrond," the wizard greeted him with a bow of his head. He smiled and stood up from his seat. "Gandalf," he greeted him in return. He looked the same as the last time. His clothing was as grey as his name, with only a blue hat upon his head being the only different color. His staff was held in his hand, a gnarled and old wooden thing. Belted around his waist was the sword he knew to be Glamdring. "It has been some time." "Indeed it has. What have you summoned me for?" "Please sit." He sat down at his desk and Gandalf sat in the chair on the opposite side of the table, taking his hat off of his head. "Dark things and rumors have been around of late, my friend. Orcs have been seen in the lands around and near Imladris, attacking villages and towns of men, always taking people with them when they flee." Sorrow filled the wizard's eyes at the news. "Can nothing to be done to rescue those who have been taken? I have sent out riders to track down these orc bands, but it always seems to be unnecessary. When they find the orcs, they are already dead and the people who have been stolen have been taken back to their homes." How interesting," he said, the sorrow being taken from his eyes. "I have heard similar things from the Rangers of the North as well as Rohan and Gondor. Orcs who raid and take prisoners are always tracked down and killed, the prisoners freed and returned to the nearest safe haven. But they never know who their savoir is. All they can remember is the sound of small bells ringing in the air, and the cry of a bird before the orcs are slaughtered. We have heard similar tales, but they also say that it is a man and his hair is as black as a raven's. Already, there are those here who call this stranger Caradhras," the Lord of Rivendell told him. Gandalf smiled. "Well, as names go, it's not a bad one. Gandalf, we know nothing of this person. Any and all attempts to find or track him have ended in naught. And this has been going for years now. How could such a person be hidden from all our efforts? Do you believe that the enemy would have one person attack his orcs and kill them so he might prove himself to be on our side?" "We must consider all the possibilities," Elrond answered. "I would not put such a suggestion past the enemy. Whoever this Caradhras is, he's not of Middle-earth. No man would hide from us. We cannot judge him when he is not here to defend himself," the wizard told him. "Perhaps, in time, he will reveal himself to us." "Perhaps," he conceded. "If he truly is saving the lives of these people, he might not be with the darkness after all." "Indeed. Now I pray that you will excuse me," Gandalf said as he stood up from his chair again. "I must be off." "And where are you heading now, Mithrandir?" he asked, curiosity filling his voice. "I'm off to see an old friend and to celebrate his birthday." There was a smile on his lips when he spoke those words. The Lord of Rivendell smiled too, for he knew who the wizard was speaking of. "Give Master Baggins my regards when you see him." "Of course," he said in reply before turning to the door, letting the sounds of the night and the light of the moon to fill the room. "Good night, Lord Elrond." He stepped out of the door and away from sight. Elrond sat in silence as his old friend and ally left. Then he stood from his chair and went over to the balcony. He looked down at Rivendell, seeing all that it was. This stranger who walked through the lands as if he was a ghost troubled him. He felt a sense of something whenever he heard news of this Caradhras. A sense of someone he knew a long time ago, someone who has long been dead. Before he knew what they were doing, his feet were taking him to one of the many halls in his home. He was alone as he walked, the sound of his feet filling the air as much as the sound of the water of the nearby river and the sound of the birds in the air. The night air was light and felt sweet upon his face, but he paid no attention to it. Soon he had left the open air and stood in another hall, looking upon a painting. "You have been gone a long time, Melon," he thought to himself. Location: Eriador. The fire cracked and spluttered, giving some small light and comfort to those who sat around it. The girl and the boy he had rescued 3 days past had fallen asleep, but he was still awake. All around them, the night was alive with the sounds of the forest. But he did not pay attention to the night. He only watched the fire. It had been 10 years since he had come here. 10 years since he and his friend, if not brother, fought against each other. 10 years since he was given one chance to leave and took it. 10 years since the power that came with the mark on his hand was sealed. 10 years since he took his first step onto the shores of this land. 10 years, he thought to himself. It has been a long time. But it was not something he had hated. Before he had left, he wanted to destroy the world he knew and rebuild it so it would better. But when he left, he found that leaving the world that he knew was enough. It was better this way. The troubles of the world he knew no longer plagued and haunted him and his friends, for he did regard them as his friends once more. In that short time they had fought together again, would be safe from whatever harm he might have caused them. A noise came from the lips of the boy, getting his attention and making him smile a little. At the beginning, he wasn't sure why he did this, tracking down these Oni-like creatures, killing them, and rescuing those they had taken. But when he brought the rescued back to their home and saw their families hold them tightly with tears in their eyes, he found that reason. It was so parents would never wonder what had happened to their children and the children could see their parents again. And once he was sure they were home, he would leave, although there were times he stayed the night. He also knew the people of these lands have tried seeking him out. He saw no reason for them to do this. He was content to be nothing but a stranger, a mere ghost to the people who lived here. I wonder what he would say about that, he wondered to himself, thinking about his friend before chuckling a little. He'd probably praise me for saving these people and yell at me for hiding away. He stoked the fire, keeping its life going for a bit longer. It would ward off most animals that lived in the surrounding forests. When it died, his senses would be their shield. The children's home was 2 days from here if they kept the same pace. They would be home soon. Once he was done with the fire, he lay down next to it with his back on the ground. Within a few moments, he was asleep. Location: Arwen. Her horse raced across the land, through plains and forests. She urged him on with all possible speed. She had to get to her home, to Rivendell. Frodo sat in the saddle in front of her, but she could feel him fading. The Morgul blade fragment was still in his heart, and it was drawing him into the shadow world. She needed to get him to her father so he can be healed. But even as she raced towards home, the Nazgul were following her, all 9 of them. Even though she dared not look back, she could hear the pounding of their horses' hooves and their screeches of triumph of finding her. Soon they appeared to her sides and she could not help but look at them. They were all cloaked in black robes, wearing armored boots and iron gauntlets. They rode horses that were as black as their robes. Beneath their cowls, there was nothing. Whatever had been of their former lives was no longer there to see. They closed around her, trying to box her in with their own horses. One of them reached out for the hobbit she carried. His armored hand was all but a few inches from taking a hold of Frodo. She quickly spoke to her horse, urging him to run faster, to break away from the trap they would be stuck in. He responded and raced ahead into the forest, breaking out of the box they would have been trapped in. She knew that wouldn't stop the ring race, but she knew where she was. If she could avoid them for just a little longer, she would reach the fort of Bruinen. Beyond that lay Rivendell. After a few minutes of tense outmaneuvering and dodging, she burst out of the forest towards the ford, going across it without any hesitation. A few seconds after she had crossed, the Nazgul appeared. Their horses stopped at the edge of the ford, hesitant to cross. They screeched in fury at what she had done. "Give up the halfling, she elf!" one of them ordered her. Frodo groaned, as if he heard those words. She drew her blade and held it high. If you want him, come and claim him, she shouted in defiance. All 9 drew their swords in response and began urging their horses into the water. But before they could even make a single step, the sound of birds chirping filled the air. Something leapt out from the forest and charged at the Nazgul. In a single moment, she saw a streak of light and all 9 horses were on the ground, dead, and taking their riders with them. As the ringwraiths struggled to get free, Arwen saw what looked to be a man with a hat of some kind on his head and wearing a coat with red clouds standing in the river between her and them. Go! He commanded her without turning to face her. Get to safety. I will hold them. She would have said that he was the one who should get to safety. But Frodo was getting weaker, she could feel it. I will send aid to you, she promised to him before turning her horse around and urging him on again. She only focused on getting to Rivendell, and was relieved when she finally saw it. Her horse galloped across the bridge and into the courtyard beyond it, getting the attention of the servants nearby, who rushed to her side. Get this hobbit to my father, she commanded, helping them take Frodo off of the saddle. He's been pierced by a Morgul blade. He was taken away quickly, which allowed 3 elves to appear before her. Sister, her brother Elrohir said when he approached her. Beside him was his twin Elladan and Glorfindel. It was the third who she turned to. Lord Glorfindel, you must take whatever warriors who are here and ride for the ford at once, she told him. A man is there. He's holding off the Nazgul and will soon perish if aid is not sent to him. The elf lord turned away at once, calling for his horse and sword. Her brothers did the same, as did any elf who was a warrior. Within minutes, a score of them rode out. This might have been a bad idea, he thought to himself as he fought the 9 creatures in the water, sword in one hand and kunai in the other. Have I been missing him so much, I'm channeling him? When he first saw the woman fleeing from the Black Riders, he knew that she would not last. Assuming that the riders were just cloaked humans, he followed them and intervened, giving the woman the time to flee. It was only when the riders attacked him that he realized that they were not humans. He was able to hold his own, barely. But he would like to put that down to the number of them, not their skill or power. He made sure to never let them encircle him. It would be the death of him if they did. He was always moving, evading and then counterattacking. Swords clashed against swords as they attacked him, never giving him enough time or space to weave hand seals. The sounds of horses mingled with the sound of the running river. Casting a quick look back, he saw riders appear at the edge of the bank of the ford. The creatures saw them as well. Screeching in either anger or madness, they fled back to the forest they had come out of, leaving him there, standing on the water. Sheathing his sword and putting away the kunai, he looked around for his conical hat, and saw the ruins of it floating down the river. Shame, he had liked that hat. It had been with him just as long as the coat he wore, which was now showed many cuts and tears from where the swords of the creatures had struck him. How do you fare, friend? One of the riders called out to him. I'm fine, he replied without taking his eyes off where the creatures ran. He took a step in that direction and felt weak. Where are you going? Another of the riders asked him. After them, he answered. If he could track them down one by one, he could probably take them out. Apparently, the riders seemed to think differently about it. You are mad to go after them, the first rider told him. Do you not know what they were? Monsters, that's all. That was all he needed to know. Those are not just any monsters. They are the Nazgul, the 9 ringwraiths of Sauron. You are lucky to have lasted this long against all 9 of them. From the way he said those words, the rider sounded surprised that he had lived, period. Not luck, just skill, he told them, still keeping his eyes on the forest. By now it was probably too late to keep pace with them, not in the state he was in. Friend, you are weakened and tired, I can see it in the way you hold yourself now. I beg you, come with us to Imladris. There is food and drink as well as a good bed. He would have walked away, to go after those monsters. But the sound of a good bed, which he hadn't had since he brought those 2 children back to their homes 5 months ago and stayed one night, was too tempting to pass up. Very well, I will go with you, he declared, turning to face them. There were 12 riders, lightly armored and carrying weapons. They held themselves with a grace he had only seen in the most experienced of shinobi, and their ears were tapered. These must be the elves I've heard so much of, he thought to himself. I am Glorfindel of Rivendell, the rider in the front introduced himself. And you are? Uchiha Sasuke, he answered as he came out of the ford, walking on the water until his feet reached dry land. Chapter 2: To have a common past. Location: Rivendell. When Frodo had been brought to Elrond, he began to heal the hobbit immediately. The process took more than a few days, and even when it was done and Frodo had been saved, he was left in a deep sleep. It was only then that the Lord of Rivendell had learned that Glorfindel and his sons had brought who they believed to be Caradhras to Rivendell. During the time of healing, they had placed him in a spare room and allowed him to wander the halls, but always kept a close watch on him. It was past time for him to introduce himself to his guests, as was his duty as a host. When Glorfindel told him that he was in one of the halls, he went to meet this Caradhras. He found the man standing before a painting and took the time to observe him. He was young, probably only 27 or so. His hair was black and fell to the back of his shoulder blades in messy spikes, while 2 locks fell down the sides of his face, resting on the chest of the coat he wore. The coat itself was black with red clouds outlined in white, but had cuts and tears on it. What skin he showed was fair, but his black eyes were focused on the painting, or rather, on one thing in the painting. You seem to see one thing rather the whole, the Lord of Rivendell said as he walked forward, getting the attention of Caradhras. What is it that you see? The young man turned his gaze to him, eyes instantly looking to see if he was a threat or not. Who are you? He asked, his tone guarded. While the question might have sounded rude, Elrond took no offense at it. I am Elrond, Lord of Rivendell, of which you've been staying in for the past few days, he introduced himself. Those black eyes looked at him for a moment longer. Then they flicked back to the painting. It is interesting to see a person stand before me and also see him in a painting that looks to be ancient, Caradhras remarked. Either you are immortal, or you have an ancestor with whom you share the same face with. I have never shared a face with an ancestor of mine, and I was there in what the painting portrays. It portrayed the evening was after the Black Gate of Mordor fell, and it shows all the leaders of the last alliance sitting around a fire. In the painting, he sat next to Go-Galad, the last High King of the Noldor, whose great glaive, Aeglos, rested by his side. Elendil, the High King of both Arnor and Gondor, and his sons, Isildur and Anarion, sat opposite of them. His sword, Narsil, rested in his lap while he held a whetstone in his hand. At their side was Durin IV, king of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, his hand resting on his war axe. Isildur and Anarion sat staunchly by their father's side, while the Elrond in the painting did the same with Gil-galad. While Durin sat by the sides of men, he did not look like he was speaking with them. The way the painting was created, they all looked to be deep in conference with one another. If not for the seriousness of the rest of the painting, which even showed the ruins of the Black Gate in the far background, it would have looked like they were having a conversation to pass the night. But they were not who Caradhras was looking at. Instead, his eyes were focused on the man who sat next to Elrond. He wore clothes that were not same to what the others wore. Save for a pair of pauldrons on his shoulders and a breastplate, he wore no armor. He was staring into the fire, and the fire was painted in such a way, it blocked the view of his eyes, leaving only his eyebrows, which were cut short, to be seen. What is he doing in this painting? Caradhras asked Elrond, pointing at the man. He was there, fighting in that war. It was because of him the Black Gate fell. He paused for a moment. And he saved my life from ending at the hands of a troll. Had it not been for that man, his skull would have been crushed from a hammer. How much do you know of him? That was a strange question, to be sure. But one that had followed him ever since that man, who he had called Melon, had left Middle-earth. I'm afraid not much. Even the name he gave us was not his actual one. He had only asked that we called him Kage. He was a mystery to all of us, but he was invulnerable to the Alliance. Were it not for his eyes, for the Lord of Rivendell remembered the power those eyes had held, the last Alliance would have lost more soldiers than they had. Caradhras stood silent for a minute or so before he spoke again. His actual name was Indra. He was the firstborn son of Otsutsuki Hagoromo, the Rikudo Sennin, he told the elf. To have found that he had been in this land is surprising. Elrond was surprised to hear this come from a stranger in these lands. But the name he had been given had sounded just foreign as the name he had been given all those years ago. And how is it that you know more about this man than I do, even when you haven't met him? Because I am his last descendant, he answered, finally turning to look at his host. My name is not Caradhras, it is Uchiha Sasuke, last of the Uchiha clan. It was a formal introduction, and the Lord of Rivendell accepted it as such. Welcome to Rivendell, Uchiha Sasuke, he said in greeting. I apologize for not greeting you earlier. There's no need to apologize, the man told him. You were busy saving that child's life. I was of secondary importance to that. There was also the fact that he had fallen asleep when shown his room and slept for a day, but there was no need to mention that to his host. But now his host was confused. What child do you speak of? He frowned. The child that was being carried by the elf woman on the horse, he explained. That was no child, that was Frodo Baggins, a hobbit, Elrond explained, realizing what he meant. Now he was the one who confused. What's a hobbit? He had been wandering these lands for the past 10 years. He had met different kingdoms of humans and had heard of the elves and dwarves, but he had never heard of a hobbit before. That, I'm afraid, is a question you shall have to ask a hobbit. It would be rather rude to speak of them when they are not there to explain it themselves, though men had often done that about the elves and dwarfs. Why did you fight the Nazgul and allowed my daughter, Arwen, to ride for Rivendell? She needed help. She would not have lasted against them. A smile graced his lips when he heard that. You do not know the elves, my young friend. When she crossed the ford, she was in my realm. All she had to do was speak the words and help would have come to her. I did not know that. All I know is that I saw someone standing against 9 creatures while also carrying someone. If it had come to a fight, her attention would have been divided, and she would not have lasted then. So I slew their mounts, and fought them so she could flee to safety. There are very few who are bold enough to fight the Nazgul, but never have they done so against all 9. To do so would have been suicidal at best. You say that like I had intended to kill all of them at that moment, Sasuke remarked. I had not. It was only after they had fled that I had planned to track them down and kill them off, one by one. You would not have succeeded. The ringwraiths are not like men, elves, or dwarfs. They can sense each other, and will hasten to another's aid if one of them is attacked. There were many records of how attempted ambushes of the Nazgul always ended horribly. Then perhaps it's for the better that your man convinced me to come here. He paused for a moment, and then started talking again. I'll only stay for a few more days and then I will be on my way. He had already been longer than he usually stayed at a place. It was time that he left. Actually, I hope that you will stay longer, young Sasuke, Elrond told him. Events are taking shape that could change the world. For the better or for the worse has yet to be decided. Since Frodo has brought the One Ring to Rivendell, I have called for a council so that the free peoples of Middle-earth may decide what to do. And why do you want me? I am not from Middle-earth. That is true. But I believe that, like your ancestor, you will help decide the outcome. All that I ask is that you stay until all the delegates have arrived and that join the council when it is convened. It was a feeling that fueled his belief, for it seemed to him that the descendant was like the ancestor, only he did not know it himself. But the young Caradhras only shook his head. I can't. It's not my place. I am a stranger in these lands and I am content to stay a stranger. You have been a stranger for years now, Caradhras. I think it is time that you stepped out of the shadows. Those words seemed to ring in his ears and his mind. How long had he been in the shadows and in the darkness? Even when he had come to these lands, he had stayed where it was most familiar, and for good reason. But now, he was being asked to step out of what he knew and back into the light that he had abandoned when he was only 12. He didn't know what it was exactly that made him think about it when before, his answer would have been no straight away. Maybe it was how the Elven Lord spoke to him, or maybe it was how he sounded like he had faith in him. An image of a moronic grin on a familiar blonde filled his head as he thought about that choice. Can we take you, Naruto? He thought not unkindly. Why does your faith in me always seem to follow me around? When they had clashed for the last time and Naruto was the one who stood over him in victory, he would have thought that faith would be shattered. But it remained firm when the blonde pulled him up by his marked hand and told him that he was being given one last chance to leave. It was only on the ship that Sasuke realized that was when the power in his marked hand had been sealed. And now, someone else was showing him that same kind of faith. If the truth of the moment was being told, he found himself to be a little scared by it, even hesitant. Let's just see where this goes, he thought to himself, willing himself to step forward. Very well, I accept your offer, Lord Elrond, he told the elf. But if I'm going to join this council of yours, I will need to know what exactly is happening. Therefore, I need information. The libraries here in Rivendell are at your disposal, Elrond told him, glad to have him stay. Is there anything else you will need? Needle and thread, he said after a moment of silence, lifting an arm to show the damage his coat had. As the days went on and Rivendell waited for all the delegates of the Free Peoples to arrive, Sasuke busied himself with learning what he needed to know, repairing his coat, or just training. During this time, he had also given himself a bit of a haircut and rid himself of those 2 locks. They had been bugging him for the past month or so. It was while he was training himself that he finally met hobbits. Or rather, they saw him before he saw them. What do you think he's doing? Pippin asked Merry as the 2 of them, as well Sam and Frodo, who had woken up only 2 days past, watched as the man moved around an empty courtyard. They were not the only ones to be watching, as Strider and the sons of Lord Elrond were watching too. Probably exercise, Merry answered him. But what kind of exercise? He tried to clarify. Do you think it's some sort of dancing? It certainly looks like it. But I think if we ask him that, it would be rather rude, Sam told them. As the hobbits spoke, the subject of their discussion spun in a half-circle and brought his hands out into a gesture that almost looked like they were pushing something away. Frodo, how do you fare? Strider asked the 4th hobbit once he had realized that they were there. I'm well, Strider. Thank you, Frodo told him, walking over to him with the other 3 hobbits following him. He had been feeling much better since Lord Elrond had saved his life. But my friends and I were wondering what exactly is he doing down there? He gestured down to where the raven-haired man was still moving. No, I do not, he admitted. Perhaps Caradhras is just dancing? Elrohir suggested with a small smile on his lips. See? I told you, Pippin told Merry. I think that Caradhras would take it as an insult if you called whatever it is he's doing a dance. Strider told the elf pointedly, turning to face him. A jest, Estel, he replied easily enough. It was only a jest. But still, perhaps one of us should spar against him, to see how good he actually is, his twin brother suggested. Elrohir smiled at that. Perhaps 2 of us should do it, he suggested and returned, making his twin smile as well. They knew their strengths and they knew that there were a very few who could manage against both of them. Mr. Elrohir and Mr. Eladan, I think he is done, Sam told the 2 of them, looking down at the man, who had stopped moving. The 2 brothers shared one more look with one another before descending down to the courtyard. Well met, Caradhras, Eladan called out to the man. He turned to see who it was that called for his given name, seeing that it was the twin sons of Lord Elrond. They had been his guides through Rivendell, but in a sense, they were also his watchers. Whenever he delved into the library to find what he needed to know, they would stay in sight of him. Which one are you? He asked the twin who had spoken. I'm Eladan, he admitted. They had tried switching identities the first few days they had known him, just to see if they could fool him. But he always called them out on it, and was proven right most of the time, so they just stopped. What do you need? We were wondering if you cared to spare with both of us. A couple moments of silence followed that question, and in those seconds, the twins took the chance to study their would-be opponent. His clothes showed how he had traveled all over Middle-earth. His boots were from Rohan, while his leggings looked like they had been made in Gondor. The stitching on his shirt showed that came from the north, but the design was not. If anything, the design of the short-sleeved shirt was so one end was pulled over the other and tied off, probably something from where he came. But what caught the eye was the fact that his left arm, from the shoulder to fingertips, was covered in bandages. They did not know why that was the case, but they did know he could move it with perfect functionality. They could also tell that despite the different places he got the clothes, they had all been designed so that he could fade away from sight. After those moments of silence were done, Caradhras finally spoke. "Fine," he told the two of them. His hand reached back and grabbed hold of what looked like some sort of iron bar to the hobbits. But the twins knew that was only his sword and promptly drew their own. "We're ready to begin when you are," Elrond told him. "Then wait," he replied. His free hand reached for a pocket and pulled a strip of black cloth out from it. "What is that for?" Elrond asked him, confused and curious about it. "It's a handicap," he answered, more focused on tying the cloth around his eyes and making sure it was secure. "Why is he doing that?" Pippin asked, very confused by what he saw. "Does it look like I know, Pippin?" Merry asked back, sounding a little annoyed with the pointless question. "Well, there has to be a reason," he protested. "He did say it was a handicap," Frodo told the rest of his fellow hobbits. "But I do not know why he would want to do that to himself. Strider, can you guess?" he asked the man, who now stood closer to them. "I am not sure myself, for I have never seen something like this before," Strider admitted. "Perhaps he means to practice using his other senses by forbidding himself from using one. It would certainly seem like. The few times he had practiced without the use of his eyes in swordplay, he had thought his sense of hearing and feeling had sharpened somewhat. But those feelings did not last long, and he did not think much of it. Once he was sure it was secure around his eyes, Sasuke looked in the direction of the elf twins. "Attack," he ordered them, keeping his sword sheathed but ready to use. Elrond and Elrond shared a look again. They had never really seen anyone do this, and it made them uneasy. "Are you sure?" Elrond asked him. "You do not need to fight blinded." "Attack," he ordered them again, this time sounding a bit impatient. They did as ordered, stepping forward as one and then breaking off so that they could attack from the sides. It was a tactic that they knew by heart, as was the sword strike from above that followed. But what not the norm was the fact that Sasuke lifted his sword up to block the strikes, unsheathing it just a little so that the length would be long enough to block both. He sheathed the sword and dropped low. He tried to knock them off of their feet with a kick, but they stepped back away from the foot. When the blindfolded man stood back up, they attacked again, trying to work as a coordinated team. It was an impressive display of swordsmanship and teamwork, those who saw the spar would later admit, and the number of people watching was growing. But despite their teamwork, Sasuke always parried or blocked their strikes with his sword still in its sheath. Whenever he moved, it seemed like he was acting just before they did, stopping their attacks just before they could actually do anything. And he never really moved. He might take a step forward or a step back, but it was only to block or parry. If not for those steps, he would have been like a statue. "My old gaffer would not believe this if he saw it," Sam declared as he watched the spar go on. "I don't believe this, and I'm seeing this," Merry told him, his eyes riveted on the spar. He didn't know one could use the sheath of a sword as a method to block things. "Neither have Elrond or Elrond," Strider remarked, watching the twins as they kept acting as a team. Whatever thoughts they had of this being an easy spar had long since vanished. The expressions on their faces had hardened. Again and again, they kept attacking on the man they called Caradhras. And again, he only blocked and parried, with the occasional kick or punch thrown in to keep them off balance. The sound of steel striking steel filled the courtyard as the three fought. More people were being attracted by the sounds of a fight. Even the delegates that had come for the council were looking in. "What goes on here, Estel?" a long-haired blonde elf asked Strider, walking up to beside him. He was dressed in clothes of green that would allow him to stay hidden from the eye in a forest, and carried a bow on his back along with a quiver of arrows. "Greetings, Legolas," he said to the elf in reply, knowing him to be the son of King Thranduil and a prince of Mirkwood. "Lord Elrond's sons are sparring against Caradhras, and are losing the spar." "They fight against Caradhras? Truly?" the prince of Mirkwood asked. The woodland elves had heard of this stranger who wandered the lands. They had even seen him pass through the forest sometimes, but he was always passing through. Whenever there had been an orc band going through the woods and there had been reports of the man, The orcs were killed long before the elves found them. An elf impressed by a man? This must truly be an interesting sight, a gruff voice remarked as two dwarves approached. Both were red of hair and had great beards on their faces, showing that they were related. In their hands, they carried axes in such a way that showed they knew how to use them. The elder of the two dwarves had been the one to speak. It was Frodo who was the first to recognize the elder dwarf, even though they had never met. "You are Gloin, part of the company that retook the Lonely Mountain," he said. "Aye, that would be me," Gloin answered, looking at him. "And how would a hobbit such as yourself know about that?" "My name is Frodo Baggins. My uncle traveled with your company. He was supposed to be the burglar." A grin broke out from the beard of the elder dwarf. "Ha! You're Bilbo's nephew. How has he been doing all these years?" "He has been well. He's here in Rivendell, actually." The grin grew even wider. "Then perhaps I should go and find him before I leave this place. It'll be good to speak with him again." His grin faded when he looked at Legolas. "I wonder if he remembers our entire journey fondly. I, for one, do not." "Well met, Lord Gloin," the elf prince told the dwarf, looking over at him. "It has been some time since we met." "Aye, it has been some time. And yet, now it doesn't feel like any time has passed." It would not have been polite to say there was a growl in his voice when he spoke those words, but it was there all the same. "Have you met my lad, Gimli?" he asked, gesturing to the younger dwarf beside him. "I believe that you once called him a goblin mutant?" Gimli looked like he had something to say about that, but Strider intervened before the conversation could to a direction they might regret later. "Peace, Lord Gloin," he told the elder dwarf. "Lord Elrond would not let the peace of Rivendell be disturbed before the council has even convened." Gloin scowled for a moment, but then nodded curtly. "Aye, I suppose that would be true," he conceded. He turned his attention back to the spar. "So, who's the lad fighting the two elves?" "The one called Crabbinder, the stranger who does not give his name and hunts down orcs," Legolas told him. "Surely you've heard of him. The king under the mountain has been getting reports from the king of Dale about someone bringing children thought lost in raids to the city, and leaving before anyone could actually thank him. The children have apparently been calling him the Bellman, for they always hear the chime of bells when he walks," Gimli said, admitting that they have heard of him, just not by the same name. As he watched the spar, Gloin's eyes remained focused on the man. Why does it feel like I should know him?" he silently asked himself. There was something vaguely familiar about the lad, but he could not figure out what it was. The spar had now attracted a great deal of people. It was rare to see a non-elf be able to match speeds with an elf. It was rarer still to see a non-elf hold his own against two elves. And yet Crabbinder was doing just that. Never once in the entire spar had he fully drawn his sword from its sheath, only enough to get the length he needed to block the strikes from Elrohir and Elladan. His blindfolded face showed nothing that could reveal what he was thinking or planning. In fact, it showed nothing at all. It was blank. Elrond's sons felt their strength start leaving them as they continued to fight. Their opponent somehow must have sensed this in them, for that was the moment when he finally acted. He shot out his foot at Elladan, hooking it behind his leg and pulling, causing the elf to fall to the ground. When he tried to stand back up, he found Crabbinder's foot pressed lightly against his throat, in such a way that all he would have to end the elf's life was pushed down. His sword was now fully out of its sheath and pointed directly at Elrohir, who tried to attack from behind, its tip lightly touching his neck. "Yield," Crabbinder ordered the two of them. They had lost, that much was obvious, and they both knew it. "We yield," they said in unison. It was enough as their victorious opponent removed both his foot and his sword from their throats, and stepped back from them. The people surrounding the courtyard began to applaud the spar, the dwarves a bit more loudly than the others. As he sheathed his sword and placed back behind him in between the two belts buckled around his waist, Elrohir went over and helped his brother stand back up. "That was well fought, Crabbinder," Elladan said once he was back on his feet. "You are quite the fighter." "I was holding back," he said in reply. "If I had been serious, you would not have lasted 5 seconds. "Then it was good that we did not commit our entire strength to this spar," Elrohir remarked. What he didn't say was that was only at the beginning of the spar. As it went on, They used more and more movements that were designed for actual combat use. By the time it had ended, they were coming at him with the intent to kill. "If you say so," he replied after a moment of silence. He had noticed that their attacks had come faster and harder as the spar went on, but it didn't mean anything to him. He reached up and pulled the blindfold from his eyes, allowing him to see once more. Durant's beard swore glowing once he saw the eyes of the man, making everyone near to him look at him with surprise in their eyes. That surprise was doubled when he began to laugh and make his way down to the courtyard, getting the attention of the elves and man there. "Madara, lad," he said to the bellman. "It's been 60 years and you still look the same as you did when you left. Don't tell me you've found out how to live forever from those elves. The rest of the lads won't let you off lightly for that." Sasuke could only stare at the dwarf in shock. "You think I am Madara?" he finally asked. Most of the people he had met who knew Madara, few they be, and dead, had said that he looked more like Izuna. Had he changed so much in the past 10 years? The grin that had appeared on the dwarf's face faded a little. "So, you aren't Uchiha Madara?" "I am Uchiha Sasuke," he clarified. "Uchiha Madara is my ancestor." "How do you know him?" The grin had turned to a smile. The people of the Lonely Mountain and Dale are not likely to forget Madara the Dragon Dueler, who forced Smaug to the ground and tore off his wings, giving Bard time to shoot the black arrow, Glowing told him. "What's all this noise going on here? I had never thought Rivendell would be so noisy," Bilbo remarked from behind everyone. Frodo turned to his uncle, walked slowly towards the courtyard, and a smile appeared on his face. He was glad to see the old hobbit, even when he looked much older than he did in the Shire. Glowing looked up when he heard the voice of his old friend. "Bilbo, you old burglar, you look ancient," he called up to the hobbit. "You don't look any younger, Glowing," he called down, a smile on his lips when he saw his old friend. "I'm surprised that hair of yours hasn't turned white already. It's no use trying to stay young, you're older than I am." "Don't worry, Gimli has been trying his best to turn my hair white, but he hasn't succeeded yet." He looked back at the man beside him. "Take a look at this lad here, Bilbo. Does he remind you of anyone in particular?" The elder Baggins peered down at Sasuke, narrowing his eyes a little as he looked. Then his eyes widened in surprise. "My goodness," he said. "If I did not know any better, I would say I was seeing a ghost. Madara, my dear friend, is that you?" Madara was a dear friend to him. Sasuke thought to himself, surprised by that. But while he tried to figure all that out, he noticed that there were too many people watching him at that moment. "Can we have this conversation privately?" he asked both Glowing and Bilbo. They had seen the same thing he had and nodded in agreement. Once they had taken themselves away from the eyes of others, the dwarf and the hobbit told him about Madara and how he was a part of retaking the Lonely Mountain. It was a tale filled with richness of adventures and locations. If Sasuke was to close his eyes, he could all but see what they were talking of. But what kept his attention was how they spoke of Madara. He remembered the Uchiha ancestor as an arrogant man who could back his arrogance with a lot of confidence, skill, and power, who was also hell-bent on subjecting the entire world into a false reality. They remembered Madara as a man who was quiet but also had a sarcastic sense of humor. Out of all of the company, he got along most well with Thorin and his nephews, Fili and Kili, and was devastated when they had been slain in battle. Once the Lonely Mountain was secured and the adventure over, he left the company, disappearing forever. "We never knew what became of him," Bilbo finished. "I do," Sasuke told him. "If I understand the time he was here in Middle-earth correctly, it would have been after he left Konohagakure, the hidden village that he helped found. He came back and tried to destroy the village, only to be stopped by Hashirama Senju, the Shodaime Hokage. From there, he told them all what had happened. He told them of how he had faked his death, and weaved a great and terrible plan to pull the entire world into a dreamlike state. He told them of how he lived to an old age and passed his plan to another Uchiha, who he had corrupted and manipulated into believing the same thing, before dying. He told them of when his soul was brought back to the living world to fight in a war, and when he managed to bring himself back to life. And he told them he was defeated and killed. The only thing he didn't tell them was how he was killed and what happened afterwards, because that was something else entirely. Both Bilbo and Gloin had saddened expressions upon their faces once he had finished telling his tale. Did all that truly happen? Gloin asked him. Aye, it did. I was there in the battle where he was killed, he answered with a nod. What exactly was this plan of his? Bilbo asked. He would have cast a powerful jutsu on the moon, making it reflect down on the earth. Once people were in its light, they were trapped in the jutsu. He meant to strip the world of its free will, so that there would be no more struggles or conflicts. The dwarf amongst them turned grim when he heard those words. So that's what he meant that day. I suppose it does, Bilbo agreed solemnly. What do you think would happen if we hadn't been grieving for Thorin, Fili, and Kili that day? Do you think we would have heard more than what he was just saying, Gloin? Even if we did, and even if we had asked him what he meant, would we have been able to stop him? Gloin asked back. You and I both heard of the power he used to help Bjorn rescue them from the battle. Bard told us that it was the same power that allowed him to tear off Smaug's wings. I don't think we would have lived long if we turned against him. Did he say something particular? Sasuke asked him. It was the night of Thorin's funeral. At the feast, we all shared a table. He had started wondering aloud about what there was a world that had no good or evil, no right or wrong, no winners and no losers. We had assumed that he was speaking from grief of being unable to save them, so we did not pay much heed to it. But within the next few days he disappeared. He stood up from where he had sat. Forgive me, Bilbo. But I should go make sure dwarves that came with me are settled in, and not causing a mess that we're going to regret later. There's no need to apologize, Gloin. We'll talk later, the hobbit told him with a smile. The dwarf left, leaving the old Baggins and the uchiha alone. So you are a hobbit, Sasuke finally said to break the silence. It might have sounded rude, but Bilbo only smiled. And you are one of the big folk. A rather strange one, I might add, he said in reply. True. Have you ever been to the Shire in your travels? The old hobbit had heard about the man sitting before him from Elrond at one time during a dinner they had together, so he knew of how long he had been here in Middle-earth. He shook his head. No, I haven't. The Rangers kept its borders protected, and I had no wish to test their anger in trying to get past them. So I avoided those borders wherever they were. That and any Oni that I was tracking never came near there. Oni? Bilbo asked, a confused frown appearing on his face as he spoke. The word sounded strange to him, both to the ear and to the tongue. Those orc creatures, he clarified, having found their proper name only a week ago in a tome that told of how they were created. In my language, Oni means devil or demon. An accurate description of them, the hobbit admitted. There are some here who also wondered why you were tracking these orcs down in the first place. Are you one of those people? Nothing of the sort, he answered easily. But I can admit that I am curious about why a stranger in these lands would risk his life in tracking down and killing orcs. It hadn't been like that at the beginning, Sasuke admitted. I had thought that they were one of the many natives to the land and stayed out of their way, lest I insult one of them or something like that. It was like that for about 2 years or so. Then I saw a band of them attack a small village, taking children hostage. I did nothing when it happened, and then I saw the looks of sadness and horror on the faces of the parents, whose children were taken. I don't know why, but I tracked the band down, killed them, and brought the children back to the village. I watched in silence as the children ran back to their parents, becoming engulfed in hugs by them, who openly wept in joy. After that, I kept finding more and more bands of orcs who had taken children, and I went after them. And you rescued the children because it was the right thing to do? He paused for a moment, thinking it over. Perhaps, he finally conceded. But I did it more because so those parents would never have to fear for their children. Ah, now that is a good reason, the hobbit praised him. Yeah, it is. He stood up, feeling an uncomfortable feel. Forgive me, I should go. He left the elder hobbit, only to run into the younger four nearby. Hello there, I'm Pippin and this is Mary. The aforementioned hobbit introduced himself, and the hobbit standing beside him. That was something down in the courtyard. Pippin, I can introduce myself, the other hobbit said with a scowl on his face. Sasuke didn't pay attention to them. Instead, he turned his attention to the dark-haired hobbit. How are you? he asked him. Frodo was surprised to hear such a question from the man the elves called Caradhras. I am better, he answered. They say that you were the one who let Lady Arwen time to get to Rivendell. Aye, that was me. He kept looking at him until the hobbit who hadn't spoken stepped in between them. And who are you? His Yojimbo? He asked. When he saw the odd look, he clarified. It means bodyguard in my language. I'm his gardener, Sam told him. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stared at the two of them, regarding them silently. A very loyal gardener, I see, he finally spoke. Where are you from? Pippin asked him, curiosity coloring his voice. Not from Middle-earth, I think. You would be right. I'm from Southern-earth. It wasn't the actual name of his former home, but it was enough to satisfy them. If you wish to speak to your uncle, he's back there, he told Frodo, gesturing behind him. He walked past and away from the four hobbits, keeping his pace quick. It took all of his willpower to not break out into a run or to flee Rivendell right then and there. But when he finally stopped walking, someone else found him. Are you always in a hurry to go nowhere, Caradhras? Asked an old man he remembered the other elves calling Gandalf. What's it to you, old man? He asked rather rudely. The wizard just smiled kindly at him. I am just curious, that's all. You've been a stranger to us for the past 10 years and yet, you are here and invited by Lord Elrond to attend his council. Some might wonder what you said to have been given that honor. I said nothing. He was surprised to hear of my ancestry and believes that I'll help somehow. He looked at the gray-robed man. You knew my more recent ancestor. It wasn't a question nor was it an accusation. It was a statement of fact. Gandalf didn't deny it. In fact, he nodded his head. Yes. Actually, I was among the first of the people in Middle-earth to meet Madara and had introduced him to Thorin while the company was being formed. He was the only one who acted polite when they all met at Bag End, although he kept looking for a place to put his sandals. We never did find out why he kept doing that whenever we had found a house that had people living in it. He was reminiscing by the time he got to that last part. But he also sounded curious. Thankfully for him, Sasuke had the answer to that. In our land, it is considering rude to walk around a house with one's sandals or boots on, especially if you are a guest in the house. He actually had that problem when he was first wandering around Middle-earth. But he figured out quick enough that people didn't find it so. Really? Asked the Grey Wizard. How is it rude? He gave him a leveled look. Would you want to clean up the mud tracks left by a guest who had just come in from the rain? It was an answer every child knew, just not here. I see. But returning to your ancestor, I had thought he was a fine man, if not a little troubled. He gazed at Sasuke. You seem to disagree and yet, you seem to be similar to him. The last Uchiha winced slightly when he heard those words. Uchiha Madara is not positively known where I'm from, not even by his own clan. Now that he thought about it, that was probably the same for him now too. I wonder if they are afraid of me as they were of Madara. Nevertheless, he was a good friend who proved to be a valuable ally, just as his ancestor was with the last alliance. He narrowed his eyes. So you knew him too? Nothing of the sort, Gandalf replied. My order came to Middle-earth during the Third Age. The War of the Last Alliance ended the Second Age. It was Lord Elrond who told me of him later on. Both he and Madara helped the free peoples of Middle-earth in their most perilous of times and now you are here. I am here, he repeated. Although the wrong line has been here, if truth be told, he muttered to himself. If anything, it should have been Azura, Hashirama, and Naruto here to do these things. The fact that it was his ancestors was truly confusing. Why were they here? Why are you here? A small part of himself asked back. While he was musing, Gandalf had heard his mutter. You may think that your ancestors did not need to be here, but they were here and they have done good things. And I believe that you will be the same, he told Caradhras. You have faith in me? The raven-haired man asked before barking out a laugh. No one in their right mind should have faith in me. You and Lord Elrond are fools to think otherwise. The wizard smiled gently, somehow reminding him of the Sandaime Hokage. Perhaps, he said. Or perhaps it is you who has lost faith in yourself. Perhaps what is to come will restore your faith. Now those words had really confused Sasuke. So much that he stood silently while Gandalf had left. Had he lost faith in himself? When Elrond showed his faith in him and Bilbo praised him, he did not feel right. He felt hesitant and nervous, even wanting to flee, all because they had felt that he was a good man. "You're not a good man, you should know that by now," that same part of him who had spoken before reminded him. It was true, despite what people in these lands might think. He was not a good man. He hadn't been a good man since he left Konoha for Orochimaru. He wasn't even sure if he knew if he could be a good man again. Then again, Indra and Madara were not good men, yet they have done good deeds. That was most certainly true, more for Madara than Indra. But was that the reason they came here? So they could do one good deed in their lives? He started walking again, thinking that question over. In the days that followed, that question fell to the back of his mind while he focused on reading up on the information and keeping his body trained. But he now also spent time with the 4 young hobbits. Whether willingly or not, the not part usually came when Pippin came barging into the library to find him. Surprisingly, he found himself enjoying their company. They reminded him of days when he was younger and things were a lot less complicated, when he had a home and family. But with that, there also came moments of exasperation at Pippin and Merry and wondering if Itachi felt the same about him. Yet, not even Pippin and Merry were invited to join the council once the last delegate had arrived at Rivendell. It was only 2 days after that the council had convened. They all sat in a courtyard, overlooking a small hill with foliage on it. The chairs they sat in were arranged in a half-circle, so they could all look at one another evenly. In front of them sat a stone pedestal with nothing on it. Standing opposite of the half-circle was Lord Elrond and his attendants. As it was his council, he was the one to begin it. "Strangers of distant lands, friends of old, you've been summoned to answer the threat of Mordor," he began. Sasuke had a feeling that first bit was directed him. Middle-earth stands on the brink of destruction. None can escape it. You will unite, or you will fall. He looked at all who were there. Each race is bound to this fate, this one doom. He turned his attention to the only hobbit who sat amongst them. "Bring forth the ring, Frodo," he told the hobbit, gesturing to the pedestal. Frodo stood up from his seat and walked to the pedestal, knowing full well that all the eyes there were on him. His right hand felt heavy as he walked, but he didn't stop. And when he placed the ring on the pedestal, everyone began to whisper amongst themselves. "So it is true," Boromir, a man from Gondor, whispered to himself. Sasuke was quiet as he examined the ring. It was a rather common-looking ring. He had seen rings that had been more elegant or gaudy, depending on the design, how it was worn, and who was wearing. He had to admit that it did look perfect in its circular design, and he was fairly certain that he had never seen a gold ring shine like that in the sun before. "Wait, are those my thought?" he asked himself. A noise to his side led him to see Boromir stand up from his seat. He had seen the Captain General of Minas Tirith a few times during his years in Middle-earth, but he had never met the man. It was always from afar and usually not that long. But now, he was here and he was speaking. "In a dream," he began, "I saw the eastern sky grow dark. But in the west a pale light lingered." As he spoke, he slowly walked towards the pedestal. A voice was crying, "Your doom is at hand. Isildur's bane is found." He reached the pedestal with a hand reaching out. "Isildur's bane." His voice was full of fear, but also longing. "Boromir!" shouted out Lord Elrond as he stood up from his chair, trying to stop him. But Gandalf beat him to it. "Ash-Naz Durbachiluk, Ash-Naz Jimbadal." The wizard began chanting as he stood up from his chair, his voice becoming deeper and angrier. As he chanted, the sky darkened and the earth rumbled. Another voice spoke as he did, one that held much evil and sounded pleased that it could speak. The elves looked like they were in pain because of the second voice, closing their eyes and seeming willing it to stop speak. The dwarves had grabbed their axes and looked around for someone to fight while the men looked on worryingly, as did Frodo. "Ash-Naz Thurkachiluk, Ash-Burzamishi Crimpadal," finished Gandalf, having drove Boromir back into his seat. As the sky lightened and the earth went still, Elrond turned to look at the Grey Wizard. Never before had anyone uttered words of that tongue here in Imladris, he said angrily and sharply. Sasuke wasn't exactly sure what had just happened. He had assumed that what was spoken was the language of Mordor, having read about it. But what caught him by surprise that when Gandalf had begun chanting and the second voice had joined, his left hand began to burn, like it had been set ablaze. It was all he could do not to grab hold of it or cry out in pain. "I do not ask your pardon, Master Elrond," Gandalf told him. "For the black speech of Mordor may yet be heard in every corner of the West." He said to all those who were there, "The ring is altogether evil." He turned to go back to his seat, sitting down in it just as Elrond did in his own. But Boromir was not done. "It is a gift. A gift to the foes of Mordor," he declared as he stood up once again from his chair. "Why not use this ring?" He looked at everyone there. "Long has my father, the steward of Gondor, kept the forces of Mordor at bay. By the blood of our people are your lands kept safe. Give Gondor the weapon of the enemy, let us use it against him," he urged them all. "You cannot wield it. None of us can," the man the hobbits knew as Strider told him, getting his attention. "The One Ring answers to Sauron alone. It has no other master." "And what would a ranger know of this matter?" he challenged. To Sasuke's surprise, it was one of the elves who came to the ranger's defense. "This is no mere ranger," he told Boromir, standing up from his chair. "He is Aragorn, son of Arathorn. You owe him your allegiance." The Captain General of Gondor looked at the ranger with surprise in his eyes and on his face. "Aragorn?" he repeated. "This is Isildur's heir?" "An heir to the throne of Gondor," the elf proclaimed. When he heard that news, Sasuke observed the now named Aragorn. He had read of Isildur and had studied the paintings Rivendell had of him. He knew full well that his ancestor and Isildur were supposedly good friends, just as good as Indra and Elrond were, and he knew that Isildur was the one who kept the One Ring after defeating Sauron. Now, his descendant sat in the council of Elrond and all eyes were on him. He looked more than a little uncomfortable with the fact his heritage was revealed. "Have o dad, Legolas," he told the elf. While Sasuke did not understand what he had said, he could understand the meaning, especially when the elf sat down. "Gondor has no king," Boromir declared to the elf. He turned his gaze upon Aragorn. "Gondor needs no king." He went back to his chair and sat down. "Aragorn is right. We cannot use it," Gandalf said. "You have only one choice," Elrond said as he stood up from his chair. "The ring must be destroyed." That caused a bit of stir among those who were attending. "Then what are we waiting for?" Gimli demanded. He stood up from his chair, grabbed his axe, and before anyone could stop him, swung it down at the ring. But the axe shattered upon impact, and the dwarf was sent flying back to the ground. In the second of the axe actually hitting the ring, Sasuke felt another lance of fire in his left arm again, and he also noticed that Frodo had visibly flinched. Gloin and another dwarf went to Gimli's side to see that he was all right, but his eyes were focused on the smoking pedestal, where the ring still sat amongst the remains of his axe. "The ring cannot be destroyed, Gimli, son of Gloin, by any craft we here possess," Elrond told the dwarf as he got back up and sat in his chair. "The ring was made in the fires of Mount Doom. Only there can it be unmade. It must be taken deep into Mordor and cast back into the fiery chasm from whence it came." He looked at all of them there. "One of you must do this." The entire council was silent as they went over this prospect. It was a dangerous thing, to be sure. "One does not simply walk into Mordor," Boromir said aloud. "Its black gates are guarded by more than just orcs. There is evil there that does not sleep, and the Great Eye is ever watchful. 'Tis a barren wasteland, riddled with fire and ash and dust. The very air you breathe is a poisonous fume. Not with 10,000 men could you do this." He shook his head as he spoke those last words. "It is folly." "Have you heard nothing Lord Elrond just said?" Legolas demanded as he stood up from his chair. "The ring must be destroyed." "And I suppose you think you're the one to do it?" Gimli challenged the elf from where he sat. "And if we fail, what then?" Boromir demanded, standing up from his chair. "What happens when Sauron takes back what is his?" The dwarf didn't seem to hear his question, as he leapt from his chair and stared defiantly at Legolas. "I will be dead before I see the ring in the hands of an elf," he declared. That got everyone to leap up from their chairs and begin shouting at one another. Even Gandalf joined in after a second of hesitation. Do you not understand that while we bicker amongst ourselves, Sauron's power grows? None can escape it. You'll be destroyed. The wizard shouted as he stood up from his seat and joined the argument. The only people who still sat in their chairs were Elrond, Sasuke, and Frodo. And while the first two could only watch the shouting go on, the third's gaze was fixed on the ring. As he saw all those who were arguing in the middle of the ring, he saw a fire consume them all. To his ears only, he heard it whisper those words again and again. Ash-naz derbachaluk, Ash-naz jimbadal, Ash-naz thurkachaluk, Ash-burzamishi krimpidal. 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 Ash-nazg derbachaluk, Ash-nazg jimbadal, Ash-nazg thurkachaluk, Ash-burzamishi krimpidal. Over and over again, he heard those words whisper, growing louder and louder. He felt like there was nothing he could do, that he should give up and run. But when he saw those flames seemingly engulf the people there, all the elves, dwarves, and men who stood there fighting amongst themselves, the single hobbit there cast one defiant thought at the ring. No. And it was enough for him to find his courage and strength. I will take it, he declared, standing up from his seat. But none of them heard him. I will take it, he said again, louder this time. I will take the ring to Mordor. The shouting and arguing dead as they all stared at him with surprise in their eyes. Though I do not the way, he admitted. It was Gandalf who spoke first. I will help you bear this burden, Frodo Baggins, as long it is yours to bear, he said, walking forward and placing a gentle hand on the hobbit's shoulder. Aragorn, who had stayed out of the arguing, stood up from his seat. If by my life or death I can protect you, I will, he declared. He walked toward Frodo and took a knee. You have my sword. And you have my bow, Legolas declared, walking forward as well. And my axe, Gimli declared, joining them. The elf of the two didn't exactly look happy about that. For a moment, it would look like no one else would join them. Then Boromir spoke as he came forward. You carry the fate of us all, little one. He stopped and looked at Elrond. If this is indeed the will of the council, then Gondor will see it done. A shout came from behind a couple of bushes and Sam appeared from behind those bushes, running up to Frodo's side. Mr. Frodo not going anywhere without me, he declared. A loyal gardener indeed, Sasuke thought to himself. No, indeed it is hardly possible to separate you, Lord Elrond remarked. Even when he is summoned to a secret council and you are not. Wait. We're coming too, Merry shouted from behind him. When he turned around with a look of surprise on his face, he saw the two other hobbits running in and joining the group. You'd have to send us home tied in a sack to stop us. Anyway, you need people of intelligence on this sort of mission, quest, thing, Pippin told the Lord of Rivendell. The way he said it made Gandalf shake his head in exasperation. Well, that rules you out, Pip, Merry told him. For the longest moment, no one said or did anything. That moment was gone when Sasuke finally stood from his seat, bringing all eyes onto him as he walked forward to Frodo. I've heard Bilbo speak of how Madara protected each and every one of the company, and how they did the same for him, he spoke to the hobbit. If you will have me, I will do the same as my ancestor did for your uncle. Frodo gave him a small nod, which he took as acceptance. 10 companions, Elrond said as he looked at them all. So be it. You shall be the Fellowship of the Ring. Right, said Pippin. Where are we going? While everyone stared at him, Sasuke stared up at the sky. Kami, you've given me Naruto in hobbit form, he silently accused the deity. Do you hate me that much? Chapter 3, The First Steps. Location, Rivendell. Sasuke stood alone in his borrowed room, looking down at the borrowed bed. His arsenal lay upon the bed, and he was doing an inspection of each and every weapon. It was a slow process, as he was thorough. After the fellowship had been formed, they waited about 3 weeks before planning to leave. The reason for the delay was so an actual path to Mordor could be made and decoy parties to be sent to fool the Nazgul and any orcs that were keeping an eye on Rivendell. He took up a kunai and examined it carefully. Since coming to Middle-earth, his original supply of kunai and shuriken had all been exhausted. So he had been forced to have blacksmiths from all over the lands forge him new ones when he ran out. The end result was kunai and shuriken of different forging techniques and metals. Some were just as good as any made in the elemental nations, and some could be considered garbage, but he couldn't afford to be picky. The one in his hand was from Gondor. It showed in how the light gleamed against the metal. It was impressive work, and he would even dare say that it rivaled elemental work. But that would have been based against work 10 years ago. Who knows what could have changed in that time? No use asking that question when there's no one who can answer it for you, he told himself. He put the kunai down and picked up a shuriken. This was most definitely not made in Gondor. He had it made in a village forge up in the north, and he knew that weapon prudes, like Tenten, would have thought that it was best suited for cutting meat in a kitchen. Well, he didn't have the luxury of being able to pick the best. He took what he could get. He kept his inspection going, examining each and every weapon to ensure there was no rust or any damage to the weapon. Once he was satisfied that there wasn't, he would put them away in the seals on his right wrist, like he had done when he fought Itachi for the last time. Once they were all in the seal, he wrapped a bandage around the wrist, as to prevent him or anyone else from accidentally releasing the seal and getting a kunai or shuriken hurled at them. The only thing left on the bed now was his chikuto out of its sheath. He took the sword in his hand, grabbed the nearby whetstones, walked over to the small pool of water that served as a drinking fountain, to him, at least, and began to carefully sharpen the edge of his sword. He stood there, going through the motions that kept his blade sharp. It was a slow process, but a necessary one. He lost track of time as he did this, but once he was sure that the edge of his blade was sharp, he put the stones away. He grabbed the sheath and slid the sword home. Once he had it put through the belt he wore at his back, he angled it so it could be drawn quickly. There was only one more thing left in the room he needed, and that rested on a hook. He took the coat of the Akatsuki off of the hook and put it on himself. The repair work he did was good enough to fool people from a distance. But once they got close, they would be able to see where the tears had been fixed. But that didn't matter to him. All that mattered was that he could wear it without getting a chill through any holes. As he was about to leave the room and go to where the fellowship would be waiting, he stopped at the door when his eyes looked on a small, red book. It was something that Bilbo had given him a few days previous. "I only had enough time to write one copy when I was done," the Hobbit had told him when he placed the book on the table. "And the elves most certainly helped me when I couldn't write. But I want you to have this." "Why?" He smiled when he heard that. "You should read about how your ancestor was a good man, like I had known him. He deserves that much." Those words were what made him pause. He kept looking at the book, like he was trying to find its answers without even opening the cover. He knew that wasn't possible, but he still did it anyway. Finally giving up, he grabbed the book and walked out into Rivendell. The courtyard where the fellowship was supposed to meet was not far from the entrance to Rivendell. There were already a few gathered when he had arrived, mostly the hobbits, elf, and the wizard of the group. He did not say anything in way of greeting to them. Instead, he just stood off to the side and waited in silence. It was Gandalf who saw him first. "Welcome, Sasuke," the wizard greeted him. "Are you prepared for what is to come?" "Are you old man?" he asked back. He only smiled. But the hobbits had something to say. "Why do you keep calling him an old man?" Sam demanded of him. "Because he is an old man," he answered. "Why would I call him anything else? Why not call him Mr. Gandalf? That's polite." "Do not trouble yourself, Samwise Gamgee," the Grey Wizard said to him. "For Sasuke is just like Madara in this aspect." "What aspect?" Mary asked, curious to know. "That if you want his respect, you must earn it," he answered the hobbit. He cast a look over at Sasuke, who only nodded once in confirmation. That was indeed the truth of it. He did not give respect freely and truthfully. Very few people in recent times had earned it. Hell, he could count that number on his hands and with still fingers to spare. What's this about respect? Gimli asked as he strode into the courtyard. Both he and Legolas were courteous to one another but still a little standoffish. Some of the fellowship hoped that this would not last for the entire journey. We're just talking about you need to earn respect from Sasuke there, Pippin told him, gesturing to where the man was standing. I've heard my father talk about how Madara was the same. The dwarf turned to Sasuke. This I can promise you, lad. I will do my best to earn your respect, as my father did with your ancestor. All Sasuke said was, we will see. Oh come on, there's no need to act so quiet and cold, the Took of the Hobbits told him. We're a fellowship now, we're all friends here. Unbeknownst to him, both the dwarf and the elf shared an uneasy look with one another at those words. The enmity of dwarves and elves was something that had lasted long before the First Age, and those who wished it to pass would be hard-pressed to make it so. The stranger to Middle-earth just looked Pippin straight in the eye. You and I have very different definitions of the word friend, Pippin, he said. His definition was much tighter and colored. But are we not friends? Pippin asked him. He stayed silent because he did not have a definitive answer to that. Leave it alone, Pip, Merry told his friend. You don't need to ask if we're friends if you already are, you know that. Sasuke did not say anything in response to that. Instead, he allowed his eyes to wander and find something else to talk about. He found it on Frodo. Is that a new sword? He asked the hobbit, getting the attention of everyone else. It's more like an old sword, Frodo answered, his hand going to the hilt of the sword and drawing it so everyone could see it. This is Sting, the sword Bilbo found in the troll cave. Ah, that's what he was planning to do with it, Gandalf said when he looked upon the sword. He had seen Bilbo checking the sword carefully in the days before today. Now he knew why. When he saw the sword, Sasuke could see it was a beautiful blade. Where his weapons from Gondor gleamed in the light, this blade glowed subtly of silver when the light fell upon it. It had the vague shape of a leaf and the handle had silver linings in the shape of vines in it. On the blade was an inscription of Elvish that curved slightly to one end before going to the other end. He could not read the inscription, but that not of major importance. Can you wield it? He asked Frodo. Of course I can. Then show me. He took a few steps forward into an open area of the courtyard and then turned to face the hobbit. Attack me? What? A surprised Frodo asked. I want to see how good you are. So attack me with your sting. He looked back at Gandalf, looking for guidance. The wizard said nothing, which meant there would be no guidance. Seeing no other option, for he did not think Sasuke could be reasoned with at this moment, he stepped forward and hesitantly attacked the man. But his attack didn't even make contact. When he raised his sword to strike, Sasuke moved forward and slammed the palm of his hand into his chest, pushing him back. You're liable to end up dead in a fight if you hesitate like that, he told the hobbit. Strike to kill me? To his credit, Frodo did not say he couldn't do that. Instead, he came back at him with no hesitation. However, none of the hobbit's attack even touched the man. Sasuke could tell that he was an amateur with that sword. All he had to do was stay out of its path, and he could do that by twisting and turning his body. This went on for another minute, and Frodo never once struck him. Sasuke finally decided to end it, and he did it by knocking the hobbit off of his feet, sending him onto his back. You need training, he declared as he held him down with his hand. He kept the hold for only a second before releasing it, and stepping back. He looked at the other three hobbits. Merry and Pippin looked at him with awe, but Sam looked like he wanted to attack him. What goes on here? Boromir asked as he entered the courtyard, ready to leave. Sasuke looked over at him. I was proving a point to the hobbits. They might wield weapons, but they don't know how to use them. That can be easily rectified. Good. Then you can take care of it, he declared, walking away from Frodo. The captain general amongst them was caught off guard by the declaration, but that would not stop him. If there were people who needed to be trained to handle a sword, he would gladly help. So all he did was nod in response. I think you've managed to annoy Master Gamgee over there, Gimli remarked to Sasuke, looking over at the hobbit in question, who did have a look of annoyance on his face. All I did was show how new they are to swords, Crabbender said in reply. And it's good that he's annoyed with me. Oh? Why is that? It shows that he cares and looks out for Frodo. If this fellowship is going to work, we should all follow his example of dedication and loyalty. If they didn't have that, they would not last long. You do have a point there, the dwarf admitted. They stayed silent as they waited for the last member of the fellowship to arrive. But Gimli broke the silence again. Lad, about that left arm of yours. What about it? Sasuke asked him. How is that you can move it around like nothing is wrong with it when it should have been lopped off? Why would I lop off a perfectly good arm? That made no sense to him, and he let it show on his face. A perfectly good arm? Repeated Gimli. Lad, the only thing I can think of for you to have that arm covered in bandages is that it was burned by dragonfire. When he said that, the question of how only his left arm was burned came to mind, but he put that down to how fast the lad could move. Sasuke gave him a long stare before finally looking away. My arm isn't this way because it was burned, it's this way because the power it held was sealed. He left it at that, walking away so the dwarf couldn't ask any more question. Aragorn soon arrived after that and all the fellowship was there. Now, they made their way to the gate of Rivendell, where a small ceremony would take place. Lord Elrond and a delegation of elves were already waiting for them, letting them gather at the gate in silence. Once they were there, Elrond stepped forward. The ring-bearer is setting out on the quest of Mount Doom, he began. And you who travel with him, no oath nor bond is laid to go further than you will. Maybe not for them, Sasuke thought to himself, looking subtly at the rest of the fellowship. He was quite the different matter. Farewell, the Lord of Rivendell told them. Hold to your purpose and may the blessings of elves, and men, and all free folk go with you. The fellowship awaits the ring-bearer, Gandalf declared solemnly from where he stood. Frodo, who had stood before Elrond in front of the fellowship, turned and walked toward the gate, taking the lead. The wizard amongst them followed him, and so did the rest of the fellowship. Both Sasuke and Aragorn took the rear and followed everyone else, although Aragorn looked one last time at Arwen before leaving. The rest of the day, for they had left early in the morning, was spent traveling. They had a long way to go and their destination would not come to them. No one really said anything as they left Rivendell behind, and that kept on as they made their way through the lands nearby. To Sasuke's surprise, the hobbits didn't complain about how bored they were or how tired. They kept walking while Sam led the pack pony they had brought with them. By the time the sun had begun to set, they were well deep in the forest. They had found a clearing large enough to suit their needs and wasted no time in making camp. Once the fire was going, Boromir stood up and had the hobbits stand as well. Take out your swords, he told them as he stepped away from the fire so that they could have more room. The four hobbits did as they were told and Boromir began instructing them in how to use their swords. While they practiced, the rest sat in silence. Those who had pipes had them out, puffing out smoke from their mouths. Do you want one, lad? Gimli asked Sasuke after taking a puff. I've got a spare. He pulled out said spare for him to see. I don't smoke, he answered shortly, waving it away. He knew enough Katon jutsus to set a large forest ablaze. He didn't need smoke added to it. Instead, he kept his focus on the food cooking on the fire. He had been reading the book, but when Sam started practicing, he kept watch over the food. Keep your guard up, Sam! Aragorn called out to the hobbit that was currently practicing with Boromir. He must have heard the man because he instantly kept his guard up. Boromir went down when the guard went up and he had Sam pinned in only 2 moves. You have to be able to react quickly, the man from Gondor told the hobbit after withdrawing his sword. I understand, Mr. Boromir, Sam said to him. Merry, your turn, he said to Merry, who moved to attack. The clearing ringed with the sounds of practice. I hope the hobbits will get better, Legolas said as he watched the practice continue. It is only the first day, Legolas, Gandalf told him reassuringly. They will get better as we continue on this journey. It could be worse. They could be trained by an elf right now, Gimli remarked with a smirk on his lips. That could have led to opening up the old feud again, but the elf in question just smiled. Would it be any worse than being trained by a dwarf? He asked in reply. Before there could be any reply, Sasuke whipped his head away from the fire and stared off into the forest. What is it? Aragorn asked him, taking his pipe from his mouth. We're not alone out here, he said. There's another camp that way. He gestured in the direction that he was looking at. Legolas did the same and saw the flicker of light through the trees. Perhaps they are travelers on the road like us? Pippin suggested, having heard the conversation. Both Boromir and Merry had stopped their practice too and looked over at the fire. While everyone's gaze was at where Sasuke was looking, the wielders of both Glamdring and Sting noticed that their swords glowed blue. It's better to be safe than sorry. He stood up from where he had sat. I'm going to go check it out. We will come with you, Gimli declared, standing up and grabbing his axe. But he shook his head. Aragorn and Legolas can come, the rest of you stay put. The man and elf stood up when they heard their names and grabbed their weapons. What? Why the elf and not me? The dwarf demanded, a little angry at the rejection. I trust him to not make any noise when we investigate. You would make noise, Sasuke said shortly, walking into the forest with Aragorn and Legolas following him. Their walk did not take them long to find the other camp. But while the said camp did have travelers, it was not the kind of travelers one would want to meet while on the road. No, this camp was full of orcs. As the three of them hid in the forest and looked on at the camp, Legolas looked at Sasuke. It is quite fortunate that you spotted them, Crabender. Luck and I do not really know each other, he said shortly. It does, however, know Naruto very well. He did not want to count the number of times that Blonde had gotten lucky with something. Still your tongues, they are speaking, Aragorn told the two of them. The two fell silent and listened to what the orcs had to say. How long are we going to be out here? One of the orcs demanded as he ripped a chunk of meat off the bone he was holding. We're out here until our master commands otherwise, Maggot, the biggest orc there told him with a snarl in his voice. Ask a stupid question like that again and I'll rip your guts out. The first orc spat at the fire in response. Like you actually could do that, he said. A bone flew through the air and struck him in the head, knocking him out. Anyone want to question what our orders are? The biggest orc demanded, looking around the camp. None of the remaining orcs dared to even look him in the eye. I thought not. He eyed the unconscious orc. One of you lot wake his ass up, he ordered. If he doesn't wake, eat him. Sasuke had a small look of disgust at those words. They would eat one of their own? He asked quietly. In hindsight, he really shouldn't have been surprised by that. Orcs can and will do far worse than that, Aragorn assured him as they watched another of the orcs walk over to the unconscious one and kicked his body hard a few times. The unconscious orc came to and responded to the kick by drawing a knife and plunging it into the kicking orc's thigh, making him hiss in pain. That's for kicking me, the now conscious orc said. It looked the two of them were about to fight, only for the big orc to get their attention with a loud. They looked over at him. If you want to kill each other, do it on your own time, not when the master wants us to do a good job. What's the job anyway? Another orc demanded. It's not one of those napping kids' missions, is it? What did you think we're out here for? Of course we're taking kids. We're going to be dead once we take those runts. Blood Eyes will hunt us down and kill us. There's no such thing. Now shut up before I tear your head off. That threat made any other orc that wanted to say something stop and go back to their meal. Legolas and Aragorn turned away from the fire and looked at one another. We cannot let them go through with this, the elf between the two of them declared. I agree. We should head back to the rest of the fellowship and get their aid, Aragorn said. But before they could do something, they noticed that Sasuke was not with them. In fact, the young man had already walked out of the forest and into the clearing of orcs, getting their attention. Who the fuck are you? The big orc demanded. Sasuke didn't say anything. He was too busy mentally counting the number of orcs there. About 30, he thought to himself once he was done with the count. I asked you a question, you filthy maggot. No one of consequence, he finally answered the big orc. That just made the orc grin nastily. Then you won't mind if we make use of you. He looked at one of the orcs. Kill him. We're going to have man-flesh once we're done with him. The orc he ordered stood up from where he was crouching and grabbed an ugly-looking axe. He charged straight at the man, who only stood there and did nothing. Both Aragorn and Legolas had their bows out with arrows nocked and trying to get a good aim on the orc. But when they did, he was finally upon Sasuke, his axe raised high. It was in that moment did the man, taking one step to the side when the axe swung down and missed him completely. In the second it took for him to step to the side, he had drawn his sword out from his coat and beheaded the orc in one clean stroke. Silence reigned in the clearing as the body of the now dead orc crashed to the ground. "What the fuck?" one of the orcs cried out. "How did he do that?" another demanded, unaware that he was sharing a thought with a nearby elfin man. "Who cares?" the big orc rhetorically asked before shoving another orc at the man, who was just standing there with an open blade. "Kill him!" All the orcs there took that as the order it was. They all charged at the man with weapons at the ready, coming with the intent to kill. But they never would have been able to realize that intent, because the man met their charge and attacked them. His sword either met the weapons wielded by the orcs, preventing them from striking him, or cutting through the shafts, making the weapon completely useless for those who were wielding axes or spears. Once he had made the weapon useless, he also killed the orc holding it. While all this happened, he kept moving and kept his eyes opened. His tactics were working, as the big orc was getting frustrated. "What the hell's matter with you lot?" he demanded of the orcs he commanded. "It's just one man. This should be an easy meal for you lot." "We can't hit him," one of the orcs who was actually fighting told him. "He just keeps moving around." "Wait," another orc said. "Look at his eyes. He was stabbed through the heart barely a second after he said those words." But the other orcs had heard him and they looked closely at the man they were trying to kill, staring at his eyes every time they swung at him. They soon realized what the dead orc had meant. "It's blood eyes." An orc cried out in fear when he saw those eyes. "There's no such person," the big orc roared at them. "Kill him already." Despite his continued orders to do so, the attacking orcs were more likely to end dead than successfully kill the man. They seemed to die with each swing of the man's sword now. They were dying in rapid succession, and the ones that remained were more hesitant to actually try and attack him. But they still attacked and they were killed all the same. What was truly frightening for them was not the man's eyes, which was where their little nickname had originated from, but the fact that the man's face had no expression at all. It was completely emotionless and revealed nothing. While orcs were not the brightest creatures around, unless bred specifically for that, they knew that there should always be an expression on a person's face when they were fighting. But this one did not, and they were killed all the same. When the last attacking orc fell to the earth dead, the man the orcs knew as Blood Eyes stood in the middle of 29 orc corpses. "That's impossible," the big orc kept saying as he looked at all those who used to be under his command lay dead on the ground. "There's no such person as Blood Eyes. He's a myth. That's all he is, a myth." "Can a myth do this?" Sasuke asked him, pulling out a kunai and throwing it at the big orc in the space of a second. It buried itself in his forehead, which bled hard as he fell dead to the ground. Both Aragorn and Legolas came out of the forest with impressed looks on their faces, Legolas less so than Aragorn. But they both stopped when Sasuke looked at them, and they saw his eyes. "By the Vala, what has happened to your eyes?" Aragorn asked him. Sasuke knew what they were seeing, blood-red eyes with 3 black tomo encircling the pupil. "They are a gift that has been passed down through my bloodline," he answered shortly, deactivating them. It was enough of an explanation for the moment, but he had a feeling that one of them would press the issue once they got back to their own camp. He wasn't disappointed. As soon as they got back to camp, Aragorn and Legolas filled the rest of the fellowship in on what he did. While Gandalf, Gimli, and Legolas seemed to have knowing looks in their eyes, he wasn't sure how the elf knew. The men and hobbits just had questioning looks. "How is it that you have such a power?" Boromir asked him. "It's not uncommon to have such a thing in my land," he answered. He knew that if he didn't explain at least some of it, they would either not let it drop or not trust him. Many clans have what is called a Kekkei Genkai, an ability that only members of the clan can use. For the Uchiha clan, our Kekkei Genkai is called the Sharingan. He activated them so the rest of the fellowship could see them. As they gazed upon the transformed eyes, those who had seen them before felt a little unsettled by them, those who had were less so. So, Pippin tried to say, trying to avoid looking directly at the eyes, which he wasn't doing a good job of. Do they do anything else, besides look menacing? Sasuke stared at him for a long moment, letting him see both of the eyes. They allow me to anticipate and analyze the motions of my opponent, picking up on the subtle things about a person. Like what? For instance, it would allow me to read lips when I cannot hear the person actually speaking, thus allowing me to know what he was saying. It would also allow me to pick up the small things that would tell me a person is lying. The hobbit made an impressed sound in the back of his throat. That would be a useful thing to have on market day, especially for the ones who try to cheat you. Sam looked horrified at that thought. They don't do that, he protested. They don't do it to you, Sam, Mary clarified for him. The farmers all love you. It's us they don't like. I wonder why that is, Gandalf remarked, looking at Mary and Pippin. Would the reason be that on one market day, the two of you took a wheelbarrow and tried to either con the farmers into giving you their mushrooms for free or just outright stealing them? The two hobbits couldn't even look at the wizard when he asked them that question. On the other hand, when Frodo heard the question and saw their reaction, he looked at them. That was you too? He asked them. I believe that we are getting off topic, Boromir said, looking at the man called Crabbender. When you said anticipate, what did you mean by that? He stood up from where he sat and gestured for the man from Gondor to do the same. Draw your sword and attack me, he told Boromir once they had a little distance away from the fire. The Captain General did as he was asked and begun his attack. Stop, Sasuke told him when his sword-bearing arm was above his head. With my Sharingan, I would have seen you in this position when you would have begun to attack, giving me enough time to counter and rendered it ineffective. Such a thing would be useful when one is fighting against only one, his foe opponent conceded. But surely it would not work in a battle where you have multiple enemies attacking you. He only smirked at that. When I watch you make your move, time slows down for me, letting me see each attack. The only time that had been used against was when he tried to capture Killer Bee, but he wasn't going to tell them that. He was also not sure if it would be the same outcome if the two fought again, but that wasn't a big question, because he knew it would not happen. That is a most impressive weapon, Gimli declared. He had heard his father speak of Madara's abilities in battle, but that was all. Gloin never explained how it was like that. Now, his son suspected that he didn't get this explanation during the company's journey. That's not all the Sharingan can do, Sasuke told him. It was better for them to know than ask questions later. What else is there? Sam asked, curious to know. Boromir, attack me again, he told the man from Gondor, drawing his own sword. They exchanged blows, filling the clearing with the sound metal clashing against metal again. But unlike when Boromir was practicing with the hobbits, the sounds came faster and harder. Yet, despite his efforts, Boromir could not get past Sasuke's guard. His eyes that almost seemed to glow red away from the light of the fire stayed focused on him. They never wavered, and he found that he could not look away. At some point during the spar, the Captain General saw that the moves Sasuke was using looked familiar, very familiar. It came to him when he saw his opponent twisted his sword in such a way that only someone familiar with the style could do it. When did you learn how to fight like one of the Tower Guard? He asked when their blades were locked together. I didn't, Sasuke answered, breaking the lock and stepping back. I was copying you. What the Sharingan is most famous for is that when the wielder uses it to copy any skill or technique they see. I began fighting like a Tower Guard because you were fighting like one and I saw your movements, he explained to them all, sheathing his sword and going back to the fire. Isn't that thieving? Legolas asked him. It is, he admitted. That was one of the many reasons why enemy shinobi treaded lightly with facing an uchiha, lest their own skill set be used against them. And yet, no weapon is without its weak points, I'm sure, Gandalf said with a knowing smile. The raven-haired man cast a look at the Grey Wizard. How much does he actually know? He asked himself. I wouldn't say weak point, more like drawback. The Sharingan can't copy another Kekkei Genkai. And even if one copies a technique, they need the ability to use it. If I used it to copy how a strong man might carry away a fallen tree, I would still need the strength to pick up and carry the tree. But don't you have a lot of people calling your family thieves and whatnot? Sam asked. He knew he would if that happened to him. Sasuke stayed quiet for a moment before finally speaking. In the shinobi world, you must and will take any and all opportunities to survive. It only takes one mistake to end up dead, even more so there. A small smile that seemed bittersweet appeared on his face. As for being called thieves, people were more inclined to look at my clan with fear and respect than accuse us of that. We were a powerful clan, once. Once? Repeated Pippin. You mean something changed? Yes, something changed. And because of that change, I am now the last Uchiha. Some days he wondered if it was better to let it stay like that. The hobbit looked like he was going to ask another question when Frodo stopped him. Pippin, if he does not wish to tell us what happened, it is not our place to ask him. He was already generous enough to explain how his eyes work. Thank you, Frodo, he said to the hobbit, giving him a look of gratitude. He was a little surprised to hear someone say that, for he assumed that they would never stop asking the questions. The attention was then directed from to the food on the fire. Everyone took some and tucked in. No more questions were asked that night. The following day their journey began again and continued for many days. As they traveled, they went to higher and higher heights. As they went higher, the land around them slowly turned from heavily wooded forests to flatland with bushes and then to high hills with large clusters of rocks. They even went past a ruin or two in their journey. They all knew what the plan was. They were to stick close to the west side of the Misty Mountains while traveling south. Once they reached the Gap of Rohan, they would swing east through it and head straight for Mordor. It sounded a little simple for a plan to Sasuke, but he also realized it was like that so it could change at any moment. The Gap of Rohan did bring them close to Isengard, and since Saruman had gone over to the side of Sauron, things might become complicated once they got there. But that wasn't an immediate problem for the Fellowship, as they had yet to even reach the Gap. They were still traveling south at the beginnings of the Misty Mountains. But that came to an abrupt end one day. They stopped to take a break around a large cluster of rocks and decided to have lunch. While Sam cooked, Boromir practiced with Merry and Pippin. Both Aragorn and Frodo watched from where they sat. Move your feet, Aragorn told Pippin, who was currently the one blocking Boromir's sword strikes. They came faster, but the hobbit was able to block them. That's good, Pippin, Merry complimented his friend, standing beside him with his sword in hand. Thanks, Pippin said in reply. Faster, Boromir told them, turning his blade onto Merry. The hobbit was a little surprised, and so, his blocks were awkward to begin with. But that disappeared quickly enough. While they trained, both Legolas and Sasuke kept watch on different ends of the makeshift camp. Gandalf sat on a rock with a pipe in hand. If anyone was to ask my opinion, which I note they are not, I'd say we were taking the long way, Gimli declared after looking at the path they were to travel. He turned around to look at the wizard in the Fellowship. Gandalf, we could pass through the mines of Moria. My cousin Balin would give us a royal welcome. Gandalf knew what the dwarf was talking about. 48 years after the Lonely Mountain had been retaken and Thorin had fallen in the Battle of the Five Armies, Balin had taken a small number of dwarves, including Ori and Gimli's own uncle, Oin, to retake Moria. There had been news of some success, but that was all, and he felt fearful of what would happen in that ancient kingdom, having gone to Saruman when he was still an ally. The White Wizard agreed with his fears, and the Grey Wizard could still see him looking upon a book, his words floating in the air. The dwarves delved too greedily and too deep. You know what they awoke in the darkness of Khazad-dûm, shadow and flame. No, Gimli, he finally said. I would not take the road to Moria unless I had no other choice. Gimli was disappointed, but only a little. He could understand the wizard's unease about the suggestion. Meanwhile, Legolas moved to another spot in the camp to look that way, and he noticed something. A sharp cry of pain filled the air as Boromir accidentally struck Pippin's hand rather than his sword. But when he tried to check it, the hobbit kicked him in the leg. Get him! Merry cried as he and Pippin knocked him to the ground. For the Shire! Shouted Pippin as the two of them wrestled to keep their much larger opponent down. Hold him down, Merry! It wasn't a serious match, as Boromir couldn't help but laugh when he fought them off. Sasuke saw the so-called fight from where he was standing. They're acting like kids, he thought to himself with a roll of his eyes. But he found it amusing too. It kinda reminded him of the days at the academy. Things seemed much simpler then. After watching the match, Aragorn decided to intervene. "Gentlemen, that's enough," he declared, standing up and reaching for the hobbits. That only got him thrown to the ground when Merry and Pippin grabbed his legs and upended him. Sasuke just watched in silence as he got back onto his feet and helped Boromir get the hobbits off of him. But when he turned his head, he saw Legolas and in turn, what the elf was seeing. What the hell? He quickly went over to the elf side to get a closer look, activating his Sharingan as he walked. Sam saw him move, turned to see where he was going, and saw the same thing. "What is that?" he asked. Gimli had seen it as well but was more dismissive of it. "Nothing, it's just a wisp of cloud," he declared. "That wisp of cloud is getting bigger and darker, Gimli," Sasuke told him. Everyone else had now seen what was coming. "It's moving fast, against the wind," Boromir said with growing realization as he stood up again. It only took Legolas a few more seconds to see what it was. "Creebane from Dunland!" he shouted for all to hear. "Shit!" Sasuke swore, already moving and deactivating his Sharingan. He had been in Dunland more times than once in his travels and he had seen those birds before. They had good eyes and from what reports he had read before they left Rivendell, Saruman had managed to get them to obey him. "Hide!" Aragorn shouted for all to hear. "Frodo, Sam, take cover!" He called up to the two hobbits above as he grabbed his sword and ran for cover. "Hurry!" urged Boromir as he too ran. All around the makeshift camp, the Fellowship were grabbing their things and then running for cover. Sam also took the time to rapidly pour water on the fire, extinguishing it. They had only barely made it to cover when the Creebane descended. They all kept down and out of sight as the flock of black birds came screeching through the area. To Sasuke, who was crouching down against a curved rock, the noise reminded me of the sound the Chidori made. So that's what it sounds like on the receiving end, he thought to himself. It was truly an intimidating sound, but it just made him applicate the fact that he knew how to use it. For a minute, the flock hovered over the area before moving on. No one moved until they were sure that the Creebane were flying away. Once that was certain, they came back out into the open. "Spies of Saruman," Gandalf declared as he came out from behind the rock he was hiding behind. "The passage south is being watched." He looked at the rest of the Fellowship. "We must take the pass of Caradhras," he told them. Everyone looked up at the snow-capped mountains that stood in the distance. It was most likely going to be a dangerous route, more dangerous than the one they were originally taking. But they had no choice now. Chapter 4: Up in the Air, Down in the Rock. Location: the Fellowship. They had been climbing the mountain for 2 weeks now. They didn't reach any snow until the end of the first week. When they did, there was nothing but snow. On a good day, the snow would be only an inch or so thick and therefore would be easily walked over. But as they climbed, the good days soon became distant and the snow around them got larger and larger. What was worse was when the sun was shining brightly down on them, making the snow reflect the light. "If I had known I was going to be making my way through this kind of snow in this much light 10 years ago, I would have brought sunglasses," Sasuke grumbled silently as he climbed up the trail Gandalf had made from the front. Sure, he hadn't been afraid to climb some mountains since coming to Middle-earth, for that was where the orc bands had usually tried to escape to, but never one this high. A grunt of surprise and the sound of someone falling downhill made him turn around to see what was going on. Frodo had slipped on a small clump of snow and rolling down the trail. "Frodo," said Aragorn as he caught the hobbit and got him back on his feet. Frodo quickly wiped off the snow but noticed that the ring was missing from around his neck. He saw that it, and the chain he carried it on, had fallen onto the snow beneath them. It was picked up by Boromir, who then held it in the air by the chain. "Boromir," Aragorn called out to him. The rest of the Fellowship had now turned to see what was happening. "It is a strange fate that we should suffer so much fear and doubt over so small a thing," the man from Gondor said as he stared at the ring. "Such a little thing." He reached up to touch it, but a hand grasped his arm firmly and for a moment, he felt something directed at him. Once that moment was gone, he realized what he was doing and looked at the ring with a small measure of horror, but also lust. Boromir, Sasuke said from his side, for it was his hand holding back the arm. Give the ring back to Frodo. He released the grip he had and stepped back. Boromir hesitated for a moment, making Aragorn slowly reach for his sword. As you wish, Sasuke, the Captain General said. I care not. He made his way slowly down to Frodo and offered the ring, which the hobbit quickly took. He grinned at both Frodo and Aragorn, but when they didn't return it he laughed a short laugh and ruffled Frodo's hair before turning around. Could we get a move on? Gimli asked the rest of the fellowship. Let's find a place to rest for the evening so we are not out in the freezing cold like the last 3 nights. Indeed, let us continue, Gandalf agreed, turning back to forge the path ahead. The rest of the fellowship followed after the wizard. I am sure that we will find a nice cave to rest our weary feet in, Master Dwarf, Legolas said to Gimli, looking back at him while they climbed. Well, if we happen to find a forest up here, I will be sure to let you know, Master Elf, he replied, matching the smile on the elf's face. But I cannot guarantee that it will be green and full of life. Rather, I think it will ice blue and frozen too. Gimli, you've just described my feet, Pippin told the dwarf. And I think that if you keep talking about it, they'll come right off. Peregrine Took, your feet won't come off, Gandalf said aloud without looking back at him. However, if you don't keep moving, I will help them come off. So please keep moving. I am moving, I am moving. The hobbit moved quickly up the trail, going past the other 2 hobbits near him. Pippin, you almost scared Bill. Sam chided him while also placing a reassuring hand on the pack pony. Sorry, Bill. He called out to the pony, who seemed to nicker in response. Location: Isengard. Saruman stood in the depth of the factory he had created in the grounds of Isengard. All around him, the orcs under his command worked and toiled, creating weapons and armor, digging out his new creations and seeing that they were ready. The factory rang with all the sounds of hammer, tongs, swords, shields, armor, and fire. Amidst these sounds, the cawing of Creebane joined. The birds themselves flew into the factory as a flock, flapping through the numerous and voluminous openings that stretched from the cracked openings in the soil over their heads to the deepest levels beneath them. When they saw where the white wizard stood, they flew to him and began telling him their message. Having learned the language of birds long ago, he knew what they were saying with ease. When they had finished telling their tale, they flew away through the factory. So Gandalf, you tried to lead them over Caradhras, he mused to himself as he walked away from the ledge where he had stood. Any orcs that were nearby paid no attention to him, for he did not call out to any of them. And if that fails, where then will you go? If the mountain defeats you, will you risk a more dangerous road? He walked out of the factory built into the earth of Isengard and back into the tower. Ah, but I forget, Gandalf. You would not take that road unless you were forced. So I shall force you. Location: the Fellowship. 3 days had passed since the small incident with Boromir, who was now doing his best to keep his distance. But that was impossible now. A sudden storm had struck on the 3rd while they were traveling with a cliff to one side and the open air on the other, making the snow reach the waists of the tall people in the Fellowship easily. The short people weren't so fortunate. While Gimli could handle himself, the hobbits had to be carried by Aragorn and Boromir. How much farther can we go to find safety? Boromir called out to Gandalf while carrying Merry and Pippin. I fear for the hobbits. I cannot safely say. The Grey Wizard told him from the front, making a path through the snow with his staff. This storm and winds clouds my sight. Do you want me to scout ahead? Sasuke asked him. While Legolas was nimble enough to walk on the top of the snow, he did the same by applying chakra to his feet. He kept pace with the front of the path so he could help in any way he could. But he only shook his head. No, do not do that. I fear that if you do, you won't be able to find us again. The raven-haired man snorted at those words. I think I'll be able to find my way back. You forget what I wield. The snowstorm had nothing on his Sharingan. He would be able to see fine. Even so, please stay. It's best that we keep together. Fine, he said. Perhaps the wizard was right. He might be able to see through the snow, but he did not know this mountain. That alone could get him lost. They continued to forge a path through the snow with the wind howling through them. Time seemed to slow down as they went forward, for it was only Gandalf who was forging the trail, and with only his staff. At times, Sasuke wondered if he should help by using Katan jutsus to melt the snow. But then he reminded himself that in this cold of weather, the snow that melted would turn to ice in a short amount of time. As they made their way, Legolas heard something faint. He moved forward to hear it better, which got the attention of Sasuke. "What is it?" he asked the elf. He didn't answer straight away. Instead, he listened to the wind. The wind carried that something to his ears. It turned out to be a voice, chanting words in Quenya, one of the most ancient languages in the world. But the voice chanting the words sounded wrong to him. "There's a fell voice in the air," he told the fellowship. Gandalf listened to the wind and heard the voice as well. And he knew that voice. "It's Saruman!" he shouted in alarm. At that moment, large boulder-sized chunks of snow-encrusted stone broke free of the cliff above them. They fell down to the path, making the fellowship put their backs against the stone to protect themselves. They were successful, as the chunks struck the snow pushed to the side and then fell down even further. But the danger was still there. "He's trying to bring down the mountain," Aragorn shouted over the storm. "Gandalf, we must turn back." "No!" The wizard climbed out of the path and onto a nearby clump of hard snow. He began chanting in Quenya too, turning it into a duel of words between him and Saruman. Everyone else could watch in silence as the duel raged on. If it had been any other time, they would have found the words that came from Gandalf's lips to sound beautiful. He wasn't sure how the duel was going for either side, but Sasuke still had his eyes and the Sharingan was blazing. Past the wind and the snow, he could see the small flashes of light in the clouds. Whether this was some part of the duel or not, he didn't know and he didn't care. He saw an opportunity to end it. "Old man!" he called out to the wizard. He didn't seem to hear him, so he tried something else. "Gandalf, get clear!" This time, the Grey Wizard did hear him, and though he looked at Caradhras with some surprise, he did as he was told. The raven-haired shinobi took the clump and raised his bandaged hand into the air. He channeled his chakra through it, and it manifested as lightning engulfing his palm, stunning most of the fellowship. Directing his hand skyward, he discharged his chakra and sent it flying towards the clouds. Once it was there, he could feel the energy inside the clouds and the person trying to harness it. "Not this time," he silently declared. He caught the person off guard and took control of the storm. Lightning began to dance amidst the clouds, flowing to a central point. Once there was enough, a shape began to form. It took the shape that the rest of the fellowship did not know of, a shape of a worm-like creature with whiskers and red eyes. It opened its mouth and roared before disappearing back into the clouds. In the moment of silence that followed, with all eyes on him and the cloud, Sasuke spoke in his native language. "Be gone with the thunderclap!" He roared into the wind, lowering his hand and directing the jutsu at the original harnesser. The clouds boomed with thunder and lightning shot through the storm clouds, back to its point of origin. But because of all the noise from the roar and thunder, more of the mountain, mostly snow from the tip above, broke off and fell towards them. "Look out!" Aragorn shouted out, throwing himself back against the stone. The others did the same and Sasuke leapt from the clump. He landed back on the path just in time as the path was almost immediately buried in more snow. What rocks that fell went straight down. After the snow had stopped falling, they began digging themselves out with desperate hands formed into claws. "Can we take it, Sasuke? You overdid it," the raven-haired shinobi thought to himself as he got free. The first thing he saw was Bill. The pack pony's head was free of the snow as well as its back. Everything else was buried. "We must get off the mountain," Boromir shouted at Gandalf over the wind and snow. "Make for the Gap of Rohan and take the west road to my city." "The Gap of Rohan takes us too close to Isengard," Aragorn reminded him. "It would be like walking into a trap now." "We cannot pass over the mountain, let us go under it," Gimli declared. "Let us go through the mines of Moria." The Grey Wizard went still when he heard that. Saruman's words echoed in his head. You know what they awoke in the darkness of Khazad-dûm, shadow and flame. Let the ring-bearer decide, he finally announced. Frodo looked surprised to hear that. To be frank, either did the rest of the fellowship. They had all looked to the wizard among them for leadership. But as the hobbit in question stayed silent, they looked back to Gandalf. We cannot stay here, Boromir told him. This will be the death of the hobbits. Sasuke looked at the 4 hobbits and saw the truth in those words. They looked half frozen in the snow. But that did not sway Gandalf. Frodo, he said to the hobbit. The ring-bearer was still hesitating, not sure of what to say. But when he noticed that all eyes were still on him, he made his choice. We will go through the mines. So be it. Location: Isengard. Saruman strode into his study, angry and annoyed. He was annoyed for not ensuring that the so-called fellowship would fail to pass through Caradhras and angry for having his lightning taken and redirected back at himself. It was only due to his preparation of a spell of shielding that the lightning bolt that struck did not destroy him or the tower. But never, in all his years in Middle-earth, did someone try to strike him with his own attack. It made him furious. There was no other way to put it. If he was a lesser being, he would have started destroying the study in a rage. But he was not a lesser being and he would control his anger. It was better to use it as fuel to further his designs rather than waste it. He stalked over to his chair and sat down in it. Nearby on the table was his pipe, as black as his staff. He grabbed it and lit, taking a puff. When he had first learned of pipeweed from Gandalf, he had mocked and insulted the Grey Wizard for it. But it was only 6 decades later that he took up the habit himself, and he could admit that he found it pleasant. It also helped him think. He had seen a glimpse of the one who wrested control of the lightning from him. What stood out the most of this person were his eyes, blazing blood red. He had only seen those once before, 60 years ago. It had been that infernal company of dwarves came to Rivendell, along with the hobbit that soon carried the One Ring. But it wasn't the hobbit or the dwarves that had his interest. It was the man who had followed them, the one who seemed to observe rather than speak. After they had left, while the White Council had still been in session, he had heard of what that man had done, having brought the dragon Smaug to the ground and ripping his wings off. But he was more curious about how the man had done it. He kept asking and searching, but only found rumors. One such rumor was that the man had been a Maya and taken a giant form, which Saruman found ridiculous. Another rumor was the man had called out for the Vala for help and the Vala answered him by giving him the strength to fight the dragon, which he found even more ridiculous. The Vala wouldn't lift a finger to help a man or anyone else. They would rather watch in silence as the world around them fell to nothing. A variation of the second rumor was that he had called on the Vala from his own land to do battle with the dragon. Despite all the different rumors, they all agreed on 3 things. When the man fought the dragon, he took the larger shape of a man fully armored. The color of this larger man was purple, and was made of fire. Such was Saruman's curiosity that, when the man left for his own land, the White Wizard sent men after him. They made it to the land and began sending reports back to their master. He found the lands were called the Elemental Nations and seemed to be in a constant state of semi-war. The people seemed to embrace the savageness of their inner nature and yet, they wielded powers that made him jealous and envious. He had sent orders to see if they could capture one of the warriors called Shinobi and if so, bring them back to him. Alas, that proved to be an impossible task. Even the clumsiest of Shinobi were able to spot his men and either evade them or kill them. But now, there was one such Shinobi here in Middle-earth. More than that, it appeared that this one was a descendant of the man that traveled with the company of dwarves. And if he carried the same power his ancestor had, what Saruman could breed into his new creations with those eyes? He placed down his pipe, his mind decided. He will have those eyes. Location: the Fellowship. Since they had admitted defeat on Caradhras and decided to go through the mines of Moria, they had to turn back. And since the snow had fallen on them, they had to remake the path. Ironically enough, once they had freed Bill, the pack pony proved to be just as able to forge path as well as Gandalf. They were also lucky to find out that their path wasn't completely ruined. A day or so since they turned back, they found the remnants of their path. There had been some snow on top of it, but it wasn't enough to cause a problem. Instead, they were able to stomp it down quick enough to walk through it. When they began to actually make their way down the mountain, another storm hit them. It was not as serious or hard as the one Saruman had conjured, but still one worthy enough to be weary of. But Gimli had found a cave big enough to hold them comfortably, if not a little tightly, until the weather. They had enough wood on Bill's pack to make a fire, so they kept warm inside the cave. An interesting thing about the cave was that the sides and roof were covered in snow that had a thin layer of ice coating the surface. The light from the fire shone different shades on the lights, giving the fellowship a bit of show. I can see why the dwarves like to live beneath the mountains if they can see this every day, Legolas admitted to Gimli. If you are impressed by this, Master Elf, then what lays deeper in our mountains will astound you, the dwarf told him. Veins of metal that run through the stone like great currents of streams and rivers, caverns where clumps and clusters of jewels shine and sparkle when light is cast upon them, and the sound of water coursing through the stone and rock only to fall into an abyss is what lies beneath the surface of our mountains. Hearing this talk about of your home reminds me of the Shire, Sam said Gimli. I hope that I will be able to see its green hills and flowing streams again. He could picture it now, and if he closed his eyes, he could feel the warm sun on his face. We all feel the same way about our homes, young Samwise, Gandalf told him with a general agreement from the rest of the fellowship. The only person who held his silence was Sasuke, and the others noticed. What? He asked when he saw that their eyes were on him. Don't you miss your home? Pippin asked him. I lost the right to call Konoha my home. Why? What did you do? Drop it, Pippin, he told the hobbit sharply. All he did was make the Took confused. Drop what? I'm not holding anything to drop. While he stifled the urge to shake his head and rolled his eyes, Gandalf stepped in. He is telling you to let it go, Peregrine Took. What he has to say about his home is for him to say. So don't bother him. Pippin didn't say anything, so Boromir took the chance to do so. I've been meaning to thank you, Sasuke, for stopping me that day, he said to the man known as Crabender. Frodo and Aragorn began to feel uneasy when they heard those words. There's no need to thank me, Sasuke answered. Still, I must thank you. The man from Gondor looked just as uncomfortable as Frodo and Aragorn. I would like to think that I am a good man who wants peace. That's where you're wrong, the raven-haired man interrupted him. You are not a good man. That certainly surprised him, as he could only respond with, What? Mr. Sasuke, I think that Mr. Boromir is a very good man, Sam declared, coming to Boromir's defense. Aye, I'll stand by that, Gimli agreed. As will I, Legolas said. Same here, Merry spoke out. I think so too, Pippin announced. The Captain General looked grateful for the support he received, although he cast an uncertain look on Aragorn and Frodo when they didn't say anything. But Sasuke only frowned. You're not listening to what I'm not saying, he told them. None of you are good men and you won't find peace like that. Lad, I should warn, I can and will take offense at such words, Gimli said, his voice rumbling with a growl. While they didn't say it, the rest of the fellowship, minus the Grey Wizard, showed on their faces that they agreed with the dwarf. Sasuke, perhaps you could say what you're not saying? Gandalf suggested with a small smile on his lips and what looked like a twinkle in his eyes. These people would not have made it as shinobi, he thought to himself as he mentally rolled his eyes. None of you are good men, but neither are any of you evil men. The looks they had on their faces were replaced with looks of confusion. How could we not be good men and not be evil men? Frodo asked. Okay then, baby steps. He stood up from where he was sitting and walked over to the nearby wall, pulling out a kunai as he walked. When he reached the wall and stood before the snow, he swiftly punched it, breaking the ice. Using all parts of the kunai, he began to carve something into the snow. His body blocked what he was carving so the fellowship could not see what he was doing. When he was done and he stepped away, they examined what he created and were confused by it. What is this symbol you have created, Crabender? Legolas asked him while still examining the symbol. The basic shape was that of a circle with a line through the center that curved slightly, separating the two parts of the circle. On one side of the circle, he had dug the snow out deep, so deep that in the light of the fire it looked black. On the other side of the circle, the white snow was untouched. The only difference on the two sides was that they had a dot of the opposite color in them. The white dot was all that was left of the snow that was dug out, and the black dot was the only part he dug out on the white side. This is the symbol of the yin-yang, he told them, moving to a different patch on the wall, breaking the ice there and began carving something there. From what I've learned about Middle-earth, you see good and evil like this. He stepped away from the carving, which was a simple line and the words good and evil on either side. You see them as opposing forces that will clash again and have nothing to do with one another. This is where you are wrong. What do you mean by that? Aragorn asked him. Good and evil are not opposing forces. They are complements of each other. Without each other, they would not exist. That's not true, Sam protested. If there was no evil, the world would be a happier place. There would be no struggles or problems anywhere. If there was no evil, then what is good, Sam? What is light without darkness? What is the day without the night? He asked the hobbit, who had no answer. Such things are defined by what is their opposite, and it applies to everything that has or will existed, even these gods you call the Vala and the Dark Lord. I do not think Sauron would agree with your words if he had heard them, Crabbinder, Legolas said to him. I wasn't talking about Sauron. But Sauron is the Dark Lord, Merry said to him. Who else could you be talking about? I've read the history of this part of the earth and I believe I know it well. Sauron is only the second Dark Lord. I speak of the first, Melkor. When the name was spoken, the wind outside the cave seemed to sharpen and howl, and the fire that warmed them dimmed slightly. The fellowship all looked on quietly. It has been a long time since that name was uttered in these lands, when its name was Beleriand, Gandalf said, his voice quiet and solemn. And yet, Morgoth was evil, for he wanted to destroy this world. Or perhaps he realized the truth of what I've spoken and chose to become evil. He chose his path so that the world might go on. He chose to lie to his kin and shouldered the burden alone. A burden? Repeated Legolas, sounding offended by his words. You consider being a Dark Lord and attempting to destroy the world a burden? Yes, I do, he answered. It is a burden. A burden of being despised, hated, and cursed, a burden of everyone turning their backs or seeking to destroy you, a burden of being alone and forever being damned in the eyes of other people. Perhaps at some point, he did want to destroy or rule the world, but that is what Melkor carried on his shoulders. Someone must always carry the darkness, shoulder that hate, otherwise it would all be pointless. Do you really believe that? Sam asked him. To the hobbit, all of it sounded a little weird, and if he was being honest, wrong. I do. He looked back at the circle. The dots represents that there's a little part darkness in the light just as there is a little part of light in the darkness. To those who know this symbol, that means you can do an evil act for good and a good act for evil. Like what? Pippin asked him. How could one do a good act for evil? I think the Oath of Fëanor would be one such act, he answered. He had read about the oath and what had come because of it, like the 3 kinslayings and the declaration that they had lost the right to what they were looking for. There was also what he had tried to do, but that wasn't the point he was trying to make. What am I trying to tell you is that you are not good men and you are not evil men. You are simply men. There is light and darkness in each and every one of us. Then how are we to be men if there are both of these in us? Boromir asked him. Are you saying that we simply need to choose which one we prefer to find our peace? He shook his head. No, you just went back to the beginning again. The key to understanding and finding peace in both light and darkness is that you must find balance. Balance? Aragorn repeated after a moment of silence. Yes, balance. You must keep the light and the darkness in balance within yourself. By doing that you will find peace, he told them. He wasn't really one to say all that, but they needed the lesson more than he did. No one said a word after that. They just stayed silent and looked at the fire, thinking over his words. The next few days were spent traveling down the mountain, almost out of the snow. And while they did not have to forge their path anymore, it was still cold enough for them to shiver. Frodo, come and help, an old man Gandalf called out to the hobbit, who came over and placed himself beneath his arm. How's your shoulder? Better than it was, he answered honestly. And the ring? The wizard asked him, making him pause and look up at the bigger person between the two of them. You feel its power growing, don't you? I've felt it too. You must be careful now. Evil will be drawn to you from outside the fellowship, and I fear from within. Frodo could only cast a quick glance at Sasuke, who was passing by them. Who then do I trust? He asked Gandalf. You must trust yourself. Trust your own strength. What do you mean? There are many powers in this world for good or for evil, he told the hobbit. Some are greater than I am, and against some I have not yet been tested. Gimli, who had been walking behind them, stopped and pointed at what lay before them. The walls of Moria, he said with reverence in his voice. I will admit, that's impressive, Sasuke admitted. It may have just been a side of the mountain, but what impressed him was the sheer size of it. He could see the ends of it if he turned his head to look. It was also deceptive, as the journey to them took longer than he had originally estimated. By the time they reached the walls, night had fallen. Dwarf doors are invisible when closed, Gimli told the fellowship as they walked along the walls, tapping the stone with the back of his axe. Yes, Gimli, Gandalf agreed. Their own masters cannot find them, if their secrets are forgotten. Why doesn't that surprise me? Legolas asked aloud, making the dwarf in the fellowship glare and grumble at his back. As Sasuke looked on at the two, he could only shake his head. It seems that it wasn't enough that you gave me Naruto in the form of a hobbit, Kami. You had to put him in a dwarf, and then me in an elf as well. The way Gimli and Legolas bickered back and forth reminded Crabbinder too much of the old days with Naruto. And if the past was any indicator, those two would become the best of friends. A splash rang out amongst them as Frodo had slipped and landed his foot in the waters near the walls. It was shockingly cold, and he pulled it out just as quickly as it came in. He looked at the water, feeling uneasy about it, but he did not know why. As the hobbit rejoined the fellowship, Gandalf approached a part of the wall and began to examine it more closely. Let me see, he said to himself as his hand traced over the faint cravings he found. It didn't take him long to realize what it was and exclaimed, Ithilden. What's that? Sasuke asked, having heard him. Something that is only mirrors starlight and moonlight, he answered, turning away from the door to look up at the night sky. At that moment, the clouds in front of the moon drifted away, allowing it to shine its light down on the walls. The cravings began to glow until it revealed the image of two columns supporting an arch with trees enveloping them. Beneath the arch was a hammer, an anvil, a crown, and 7 stars, while between the 2 trees was a single star. On the arch itself, words had been engraved. It reads, "The doors of Durin, Lord of Moria, speak, friend, and enter." Gandalf told them all, using his staff to show where the words were. What do you suppose that means? Mary asked him. Oh, it's quite simple. If you are a friend, you speak the password and the doors will open. He placed his staff on the single star and began chanting in a different tone. Must be Elvish, Sasuke thought to himself. But whatever the language was, it didn't seem to work. Gandalf frowned, and then tried to again, speaking different words. He was no successful the second time than he was the first. The mood of the fellowship, which had risen since finding the walls, began to drop again. Looks began to pass between the members, and Pippin was the one who stated the obvious. Nothing's happening. Gandalf ignored him and stepped up to the door. He placed his shoulder against it and tried pushing it open. When that didn't work, he tried his hands. I once knew every spell in all the tongues of elves, men, and orcs, he muttered aloud. So you're losing your touch? Sasuke asked him with a small smirk. While the rest of the fellowship might have sent him shocked looks, Gandalf just looked at him with irritation. Now is not the time for you to prove that you are Madara's descendant, Sasuke. So, what are you going to do then? Pippin asked. That was when his temper broke. Knock your head against it, Peregrine took. And if that does not shatter them, and I'm allowed a little peace from foolish questions, I will try to find the opening words. The hobbit got the obvious hint and promptly shut up. The fellowship realized that what the wizard was planning to do would take some time. So they made themselves comfortable as they could get in that kind of area, and waited. No one kept track of time as they waited. The area began to fill with the sound of Gandalf speaking in different languages. Sasuke could hear all of them from where he leaned against the wall. To his surprise and silent delight, he found the languages to be soothing. They made him feel calm and relaxed, like something one would hear from an old relative. If it wasn't for the hint of annoyance and worry in Gandalf's voice, he would have been tempted to close his eyes and drift away into sleep. Instead, he let his eyes focus on other things, like the fact Aragorn and Sam were unpacking Bill and sending him away. Why are they doing that? He looked back at Gandalf and figured it out. A pony would probably lose its mind inside there and panic. That was never good. His attention turned to Merry and Pippin, who were throwing rocks into the water. Aragorn quickly stopped that. "Do not disturb the water," he told the hobbits, grabbing Pippin's arm before he threw a rock. "Oh, it's useless," Gandalf declared as he stepped away from the doors, tossed his staff to the ground, and sat down on a log. "Do you want me to break them down?" Sasuke asked him, gesturing to the doors. He could probably do it. It would just be loud. "No, do not do that," he said in reply. "There has to be a way to get them open." "Do you have any idea to do that, young Sasuke? Perhaps you know something that I don't." Those words were a challenge, plain and simple. And yet, it was not a serious challenge. It was more akin to an offer to see what he had thought up. But all he did was shrug his shoulders. "You make it sound like I know how to open them, and I don't. All I can offer is that perhaps the creators of these doors were being both subtle and obvious about the answer." When he heard those words, a realization struck Frodo. He stood up and more closely examined the writing, even though he could not read them. "It's a riddle," he declared. As he was figuring this all out, the water next to them began to ripple. "Speak, friend, enter." "What's the Elvish word for friend?" he asked Gandalf. "Melon," the wizard answered, and at those words, the doors began to open, drawing the attention of everyone there. Chuckling a little, Gandalf stood up and led the way, placing a crystal on the tip of his staff. "Both subtle and obvious," Gimli repeated with a grin as he entered through the doors beside Sasuke. "Now that you have said, I can see it. That was well done of you, Sasuke. Soon you and Master Elf behind us will enjoy the fabled hospitality of the dwarfs. Roaring fires, malt beer, red meat off the bone," he declared with joy as the path in front of them became clearer due to the light from Gandalf's crystal. "This is the home of my cousin Balin, and they call it a mine. A mine!" But the light from the crystal revealed things, horrible things. "This is no mine," Boromir said in realization filled with horror. "It's a tomb." Surrounding them were bodies of dead dwarves. They were everywhere, even on the stairs that lay in front of them. They had stumbled onto the site of a battle that the dwarves living in Moria had lost. "No," Gimli said in horror when he saw the skeletons, for that was all that remained of their bodies. He quickly went over to one to see it closer and saw that dwarf had been killed by 2 arrows to the neck. The armor he wore and axe he wielded were all but brown from rust, and cobwebs were spun all around him. Even his beard had turned into a mangy thing. "And oh!" howled the only living dwarf there. Legolas pulled out an arrow from one of the corpses to look at it closer. "Goblins," he said, realizing the craftsmanship, which was to say, poor but cruel. The single word he said also served as a warning to everyone. Both Boromir and Aragorn drew their swords while he knocked an arrow to his bow. Sasuke stood at the ready with his Sharingan blazing. Meanwhile, the hobbits had begun to back out of the mines. "We make for the Gap of Rohan," Boromir said in a grim but hard voice. "We never should have come here. Now get out of here! Get out!" That was when the next nasty surprise appeared. In 1 second, Frodo felt something wet and slippery grasp his leg. In the next second, it had yanked him off his feet and began dragging him to the water. He tried to get out, but the tentacle, which was what had the grasp on his leg, was strong. But the other hobbits had noticed what had happened. Crying out his name at roughly the same time, both Merry and Pippin grabbed hold of Frodo's arms and began pulling him back, creating a tug-of-war. "Strider!" cried out Sam, alerting Aragorn and the others to what was happening. The hobbit then leapt into action, drawing his blade and hacking away at the tentacle. "Get off him!" he yelled at it. Within 2 swings of his sword, The end of the tentacle was holding on by a flap of skin. It released its grasp on Frodo and withdrew to the water, disappearing beneath the surface. Both Pippin and Merry pulled their friend back, thinking that they were safe. But that feeling was incredibly short-lived when more tentacles burst out of the water, knocked 3 of the hobbits away, and grabbed the one it wanted, dragging him up into the air. Legolas stepped out of the doors, shooting the arrow he had knocked at the tentacle holding Frodo. But it did no good. Both Boromir and Aragorn were the water, cutting away at the other tentacles so they could get closer. Sasuke stood on the shore, his right hand clutching his left wrist, waiting for the right moment. When the head of the beast commanding the tentacles emerged from the water and opened its gaping maw, Frodo screamed louder as he dangled in the air, realizing the implication. Boromir hurried his swing when he saw the same thing, cutting off a tentacle faster and making the creature writhe in pain. Its writhing allowed Aragorn to get to the hobbit-grasping tentacle and cut off. The grip it had on Frodo slackened and the hobbit fell down into the safety of Boromir's arms. "Into the mines!" cried out Gandalf, urging those who were on the shore through the doors. But the creature was not done, nor was it going to give up its prize so easily. "Legolas!" shouted Boromir as he waded through the water carrying Frodo. The elf prince saw what he was silently asking for and promptly fired off an arrow, striking the creature in one of its eyes. It roared in pain and fell back slightly. "Into the cave!" shouted Aragorn as he got out of the water and raced towards the doors along with everyone else. Sasuke stood at the doors, pushing everyone else through. "Go, go!" he urged Aragorn, who was the last one through. His left palm was coated in lightning again, and he swung it wide. "Chidori Simban!" The jutsu sprayed an uncountable number of the lightning Simban into the water, shocking the creature immensely, and with any luck, killing it. Seeing that his work was done, Sasuke fled into the mines. But the Watcher was not done either. Its tentacles grasped the doors of Durin, like it was going to pull itself out of the water and after them. But what happened was the doors broke apart and fell down, along what felt like the rest of the walls to the Fellowship, who watched it happen. The way out, as well as a good portion of the entranceway, were blocked by the collapse of the stone, covering them in darkness.